Hello there and welcome to our channel, where curiosity gets comfortable, questions slow their pace, and science takes the long way around so your thoughts can begin to settle. Wherever you are right now, whether the room is dimly lit or the screen is the brightest thing nearby, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to wander somewhere that usually feels very far away, not just in distance, but in imagination. A place most of us think of as empty, frozen, and silent. A place we tend to treat as the end of the world rather than the beginning. Antarctica. At first glance, Antarctica doesn't look like it belongs in a conversation about civilization. It appears to be the opposite of where people would gather, build, experiment, and dream. It is cold, wind-scoured, buried beneath kiln of ice, and seemingly hostile to anything that isn't a penguin, a seal, or a very determined scientist in several layers of insulated clothing. Yet sometimes the places we dismiss most quickly are the ones that deserve a longer look, especially when we step back and remember that Earth has not always looked the way it does today. So tonight we're going to gently explore a question that sounds strange at first, maybe even a little unreasonable, but has a way of lingering once it settles in. What if Antarctica was once the original center of human civilization? Not a frozen wasteland, but a homeland. Not a blank space at the bottom of maps, but a starting point from which stories, people, and ideas slowly spread outward. Before we go any further, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? Is it late evening where you are, or already deep into the night? Maybe it's early morning, and the world outside is just beginning to stir. However it looks from your window, it's interesting to think that you're listening from one specific point on a spinning planet suspended in space, turning slowly beneath the stars. A planet where north and south are just directions we agreed upon, not inherent truths. A planet where what feels like the edge today may once have been the center. If you find this kind of exploration calming, or if quiet questions like this help your mind loosen its grip on the day, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this small, thoughtful corner reach others who might need a slower pace before sleep. No pressure at all, just something to consider like everything else tonight. Now, let's ease into the idea itself without rushing. Not by making bold claims or trying to convince ourselves of anything right away, but by asking how we came to see Antarctica the way we do. Most of us learned about it as children through globes, textbooks, or documentaries. It was always shown as white, distant, and empty. A place discovered late, explored reluctantly, and occupied only temporarily. There were no ancient ruins to visit. No long-lost cities rising from the snow, just ice, rock, and wind. But that picture depends entirely on one assumption, that Antarctica has always been like this, frozen, isolated, unchanging. And that assumption turns out to be quietly incorrect. Earth's climate has shifted dramatically over time. Continents have drifted. Oceans have opened and closed. Forests have turned into deserts. And shallow seas have become mountain ranges. Antarctica itself was once part of a much larger southern supercontinent called Gondwana, connected to Africa, South America, Australia, and India. There was a time long before humans existed when Antarctica sat farther north, bathed in milder sunlight, supporting forests, rivers, and diverse life. This is not speculation or myth. It's written into the rock layers, the fossil record, and the magnetic signatures locked into ancient stone. Fossilized tree trunks have been found there. Pollen from plants that require warmth has been recovered beneath the ice. Dinosaurs once walked across land that now sits under permanent snow. Antarctica was not always white. It was once green. That alone doesn't mean people live there, of course, but it does something important. It removes the idea that Antarctica has always been impossible. It opens the door just a little enough to peer through and ask what else we might be assuming without realizing it. Human history, as we usually tell it, has a comfortable shape. Civilization begins in warm river valleys: the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. Agriculture appears, populations grow. Writing emerges and cities form. The poles are absent from this story, treated as irrelevant backdrops, too cold, too dark, too extreme. Yet those stories are built from what survives. And survival depends heavily on climate. Stone endures. Ice destroys. Wood rots. Rising seas erase coastlines. If an early society existed in a region that later froze solid under kiln of moving ice, very little would remain on the surface to tell us it was ever there. Absence of evidence begins to look less like proof and more like expectation. It's also worth noticing how maps quietly shape our thinking. On most modern maps, Antarctica sits at the bottom, stretched wide, isolated, almost decorative. North is up, south is down. That's a convention, not a rule of nature, but it influences how we feel about places. Being at the bottom subtly suggests being last, marginal, or secondary. Yet if you were standing on Antarctica itself, there would be no down. Every direction would be north. From that vantage point, the rest of the world would lie outward, surrounding you. This shift in perspective matters more than it seems. Centers are defined by where we choose to stand. History often radiates outward from places we consider important, not necessarily from where events truly began. Now imagine just for a moment an ancient Earth where Antarctica was not locked in ice, where coastlines were accessible, climates were temperate, and the sun followed patterns very different from those we see today. Imagine human groups settling there, not because it was remote, but because it was central. From that position, moving outward would eventually lead to every other continent. South America, Africa, Australia, all reachable by land bridges or short sea crossings during periods of lower sea level. This doesn't require advanced technology or improbable voyages. Early humans were already capable of crossing water and adapting to diverse environments. They reached Australia tens of thousands of years ago, navigating open seas with simple tools. They thrived in Ice Age Europe and tropical forests alike. The idea that they could have lived in a milder Antarctica, if conditions allowed, is not as far-fetched as it first sounds. Of course, imagination alone isn't enough. Questions like this need to be held gently but critically. Not everything unknown is hidden history, and not every gap points to a lost civilization. Still, history has a habit of expanding when we allow it to. Troy was once thought to be a myth. Gobsai rewrote timelines we thought were settled. Human presence keeps turning up earlier and in more unexpected places than we once believed possible. Another quiet complication is ice itself. Antarctica's ice sheet is not static. It flows, compresses, and reshapes the land beneath it. Anything built on the surface before major glaciation would likely be crushed, buried, or ground away. What remains could lie deep below, unreachable with current methods or altered beyond easy recognition. In that sense, Antarctica is less an empty land and more a sealed archive. This brings us to the heart of the question, not as a claim, but as an invitation. What if Antarctica's silence is not the absence of history, but the result of it being hidden too well? What if the reason it appears disconnected from human origins is not because nothing happened there, but because everything that did happen was covered over by time, ice, and shifting continents? There are also the strange fragments that don't quite fit. The old maps that depict southern land masses with suspicious detail. The myths from different cultures that speak of a lost homeland, a great south, a place of origin before disaster or climate change forced migration. These stories are easy to dismiss individually, but together they create a faint pattern, not proof, but a suggestion. Tonight is not about deciding whether Antarctica truly was the first center of civilization. It's about allowing the question to exist without immediately shutting it down. about noticing how much of what we believe rests on conditions that just happen to preserve evidence in some places and erase it in others. About recognizing that our understanding of the past is shaped as much by geology and climate as by human action. For now, let the image settle. Not the Antarctica of blizzards and research stations, but an older version of the world. Unfamiliar, quieter, and open. A place where the ground was visible, where people might have watched the sky, learned the seasons, and eventually moved outward as the planet changed around them. Before we can even begin to picture people living at the bottom of the world, we need to slow down and rethink something most of us take for granted. Antarctica, as a place, has become mentally fused with ice. When we hear its name, we don't imagine land in any flexible or changing way. We imagine a permanent condition, an endless white surface, wind moving snow sideways, and temperatures that discourage almost everything from staying alive for long. That image feels so stable that it quietly convinces us it has always been that way. But Earth has never been that consistent, and Antarctica is no exception. To understand how different the planet once looked, it helps to step away from human time entirely. A few centuries feel long to us. A few thousand years feel abstract. But Earth's story moves on scales that stretch into hundreds of millions of years. Where continents drift, climates swing wildly, and what feels permanent turns out to be temporary. Antarctica's frozen state is not a starting point. It is a late chapter. Geology gives us the first clear hint that something very different once existed there. Beneath the ice, Antarctica is not smooth or uniform. It has mountain ranges, valleys, plateaus, and river basins carved into solid rock. These are not features created by ice alone. Many of them were shaped by flowing water long before glaciers dominated the landscape. Subglacial radars revealed river systems beneath the ice that resemble those found in temperate regions today. Rivers require sustained liquid water, not brief melting and certainly not permanent cold. Fossils reinforce this picture. Scientists have uncovered fossilized trees in Antarctica, some still rooted where they grew. These were not small, stunted plants clinging to survival. They were large trees that formed forests complete with annual growth rings that tell us about seasonal cycles. The trees belong to species that need mild temperatures and long growing seasons. Their presence means Antarctica once supported ecosystems that look nothing like the one we see now. Pollen samples extracted from sediment layers tell the same story. These microscopic grains are remarkably durable and very specific to the plants that produce them. The pollen found beneath Antarctic ice matches plants that thrive in warmer, wetter climates. Combined with fossil leaves, spores, and even traces of ancient insects, a clear pattern emerges. Antarctica was once biologically active, green, and capable of supporting complex life. This transformation did not happen overnight. Antarctica's journey from temperate land to frozen continent unfolded slowly as tectonic plates shifted. Millions of years ago, Antarctica was part of Gondwana, a massive southern supercontinent. It was connected to what are now South America, Africa, Australia, and India. Ocean currents flowed differently then, allowing warm water to reach southern latitudes. Heat was distributed more evenly across the planet, reducing the extremes we associate with the poles today. The turning point came when Antarctica began to separate from its neighbors as it drifted southward and ocean gateways opened around it. A powerful circumpolar current formed. This current isolated Antarctica climatically, cutting it off from warmer waters. Once that thermal isolation took hold, ice sheets began to grow. Snow accumulated faster than it could melt. Over time, glaciers thickened, spread, and locked the continent into the frozen state we recognize. Importantly, this deep freeze is geologically recent. Large-scale glaciation began roughly 34 million years ago. That may sound unimaginably distant, but in planetary terms it is not ancient. Mammals were already evolving. Birds existed. Primates were diversifying. Earth was not an alien world then. It was recognizably similar to the one we inhabit now, just arranged differently. Later still, Antarctica experienced warmer intervals even after glaciation began. During parts of the Mayan Epoch, millions of years after ice sheets formed, temperatures rose enough for forests to reappear in coastal regions. Ice retreated and advanced multiple times. Antarctica did not flip a switch from green to white. It transitioned unevenly, with long periods of partial ice cover and exposed land. This matters because it introduces windows of possibility. When people assume Antarctica was always frozen during human history, they're usually correct in a strict sense. Modern humans emerged long after permanent ice had taken hold. But human history is not just the story of Homo sapiens, and civilization does not require global warmth to leave traces. More importantly, Antarctica's past warmth does not have to align perfectly with known timelines to challenge our assumptions about migration, memory, and lost landscapes. Sea levels also play a critical role here. During ice ages, vast amounts of water were locked in glaciers, lowering global sea levels by as much as 120 m. Coastlines shifted dramatically. Land bridges appeared where oceans exist today. Even if Antarctica itself remained cold during later periods, surrounding regions may have been more accessible than we assume. The shape of the world that early humans navigated was not the same shape we see on modern maps. Another overlooked factor is latitude itself. Antarctica's position at the South Pole today exaggerates seasonal extremes, but before its final drift southward, it occupied lower latitudes. The sun's path would have been different. Daylight cycles would have supported plant growth in ways that are hard to imagine now. Long summer days could compensate for darker winters, much as they do in northern regions that still support human life today. When people argue that Antarctica could never support civilization, they often project modern conditions backward without adjustment. They imagine people facing constant darkness, brutal cold, and limited resources. But that image collapses once we acknowledge how much Antarctica has changed. A milder Antarctica would not have been a marginal environment. It could have been productive, especially along coasts and river valleys. At this point, it helps to clarify what we mean by civilization. The word carries heavy expectations: stone cities, writing systems, monumental architecture. But human societies existed for tens of thousands of years without those features. They organized, passed down knowledge, tracked seasons, navigated landscapes, and built social structures adapted to their environments. Civilization is not a single template. It is a spectrum of increasingly complex ways of living together. If a population lived in Antarctica during a warmer period, their material culture would likely have reflected local conditions. Wood, plant fibers, bone, and other organic materials may have been widely used. These do not survive well, especially under ice. Stone structures, if they existed at all, may have been modest, practical, and vulnerable to glacial movement. A moving ice sheet does not preserve buildings. It grinds them down. This brings us to a subtle but important point. Archaeology depends heavily on exposure. We find ancient sites where erosion, excavation, or construction reveals them. Antarctica is almost entirely sealed. Even modern research stations barely scratch the surface. Most of the land beneath the ice has never been directly observed. The absence of ruins, there is not evidence of absence. It is a reflection of inaccessibility. Imagining a different Antarctica also requires letting go of modern political and cultural boundaries. We tend to associate civilization with places that later became influential. Europe, the Middle East, East Asia, but influence flows unevenly. Early centers can vanish, leaving successors elsewhere to inherit and reshape ideas. If a southern origin existed, its descendants might not remember it as a place. They might remember it as a story. Myths from diverse cultures speak of lost lands, great floods, ancestral homelands abandoned due to environmental change. These stories are often dismissed as symbolic, but some preserve genuine memories of real events distorted over time. Rising seas after the last ice age submerged vast coastal areas. Entire ways of life disappeared beneath water. Antarctica's freezing would have been an even more dramatic erasure. If groups migrated away from a deteriorating southern homeland, they would have carried fragments of knowledge with them. Navigation techniques, astronomical observations, seasonal awareness, and symbolic systems could survive even if the original location did not. Over generations, the source would fade, replaced by new centers of activity. The memory of origin might become vague, sacred, or mythologized. From this perspective, Antarctica's emptiness becomes less surprising. It is not the lack of evidence that needs explaining. It is how thoroughly the environment would have erased it. Ice does not leave polite gaps. It reshapes landscapes on a massive scale. Mountains are worn down. Valleys are filled. Everything beneath is compressed under immense pressure. There's also a psychological barrier at work. Antarctica feels extreme, so we instinctively place it outside the human story. Yet, humans have repeatedly proven capable of adapting to environments once thought uninhabitable. The Arctic, high mountains, deserts, and open oceans were all settled earlier than expected. Each time, assumptions fell apart once evidence emerged. The question then is not whether Antarctica fits our expectations, but whether our expectations are limiting our questions. Science progresses by challenging comfortable narratives. It revises timelines, reinterprets data, and accepts uncertainty where answers are incomplete. Imagining Antarctica before ice is not a claim. It is a reframing. Consider how different Earth would feel if Antarctica were green today. Trade routes would cross the southern hemisphere differently. Cultural exchange might center there. The idea of north is up would lose meaning. What we call peripheral would feel central. History would read differently simply because the map would feel different. That mental exercise reveals how much of our thinking is shaped by geography as it exists now. We rarely account for how temporary that arrangement is. Continents wander, climates swing, oceans rearrange themselves. Human stories are written on a moving surface. As we continue, it will be important to keep separating what we know from what we assume. We know Antarctica was once warm. We know it supported complex ecosystems. We know ice destroys evidence. We know human history keeps extending deeper into the past. What we do not know is whether people ever lived there during those windows of warmth, or whether traces of that presence could still exist beneath the ice. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the space where careful thinking happens rather than rushing toward conclusions. It allows us to explore how evidence, memory, and environment interact. It also reminds us that the story of civilization is still being written, not finalized. Long before Antarctica became synonymous with ice charts and satellite images shaded in blue and white, the poles themselves played a very different role in Earth's climate story. To understand that difference, it helps to step away from the idea that the poles are naturally frozen by default. Cold at the poles feels obvious today, but it is the result of a particular planetary setup, not an eternal rule. Earth's climate system has rearranged itself many times, and during several of those arrangements, the polar regions were anything but frozen. The key factor is heat distribution. Earth receives energy from the sun unevenly, with more direct sunlight striking the equator and less reaching the poles. Today, that imbalance is reinforced by ocean currents and atmospheric circulation patterns that move heat in specific ways. Warm water travels north and south from the equator, releases heat, cools, and sinks, creating a global conveyor belt. Antarctica's isolation, surrounded by a powerful circumpolar current, now prevents much of that warmth from ever reaching it. But this isolation is relatively new. If we rewind far enough, the continents were positioned differently, and so were the oceans between them. Without open pathways for cold currents to fully encircle Antarctica, warm water could flow southward more freely. Heat accumulated instead of being deflected. The result was a planet with a much gentler temperature gradient from equator to pole. Seasons still existed, but the extremes were softened. Winters were cool rather than deadly, and summers were long and productive. Evidence for this warmth is scattered throughout the geological record, waiting patiently in stone and sediment. One of the most striking clues comes from fossilized forests found at high latitudes, including Antarctica and the Arctic. These forests were not sparse. They were dense, diverse, and long-lived. Tree rings preserved in fossil would show patterns of growth consistent with moderate temperatures and adequate rainfall. Some trees grew for centuries, something impossible in a harsh, unstable climate. The Arctic offers a useful comparison here. Fossils from northern Canada, Greenland, and Siberia reveal that these regions once supported broadleaf forests with species similar to those found in modern temperate zones. Crocodile relatives lived there. Turtles thrived. These animals require warmth to survive. Their presence tells us that polar regions were not just marginally warmer, but substantially so. Antarctica fits squarely into this pattern. During parts of the Cretaceous period, roughly 145 to 66 million years ago, global temperatures were significantly higher than today. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were elevated, enhancing the greenhouse effect. Sea levels were higher and shallow seas flooded continental interiors. Under these conditions, Antarctica supported forests of conifers and flowering plants. Rivers flowed, soil formed, life flourished. What often surprises people is that this warmth existed even with long polar nights. For months each year, the sun would dip below the horizon, just as it does now. Yet the climate remained mild enough for plants to survive. This suggests that winter temperatures did not plunge far below freezing, if they did at all. The absence of permanent ease allowed heat, stored in oceans and land, to moderate seasonal extremes. Another important contributor was cloud cover. Warmer climates tend to produce more clouds, which trap heat and reduce nighttime cooling. Combined with higher humidity and less reflective ice, the poles retain warmth more efficiently. Ice is excellent at reflecting sunlight back into space. Remove it, and the planet absorbs more energy. This feedback loop reinforces warmth once ice retreats. As Antarctica gradually cooled, the reverse feedback took over. Ice formed, reflecting sunlight, reducing heat absorption and promoting further cooling. This is how ice ages deepen. Once started, they reinforce themselves. The transition from green to white did not happen evenly or instantly. It progressed in pulses, advancing and retreating with changes in orbital cycles, atmospheric composition, and ocean circulation. These cycles matter because they define windows of opportunity. Even after Antarctica began cooling overall, there were extended periods when ice coverage was limited. Coastal regions remained ice-free. Valleys supported vegetation. The interior may have stayed colder, but the margins could have been livable. These were not brief interludes lasting a few centuries. Some lasted hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. During these times, Antarctica would have resembled modern regions that humans have successfully inhabited. Think of southern Patagonia, coastal Alaska, or parts of Scandinavia. These areas experience long winters and short summers, but they also support ecosystems, food chains, and human communities. Climate alone does not determine habitability. Stability matters just as much. Lost warmth does not simply mean higher temperatures. It means predictability. It means seasonal cycles that repeat reliably enough for living things to adapt. Plants germinate at the right time. Animals migrate or hibernate. Rivers flood and recede in patterns that can be learned. These rhythms are essential for any sustained human presence. When we talk about ancient climate, it's easy to picture a static background, as if Earth flipped between modes and stayed there. In reality, climate is dynamic, responding to multiple overlapping influences. Changes in Earth's orbit alter how sunlight is distributed. Volcanic activity injects particles and gases into the atmosphere. Continental drift reshapes ocean currents. Even the evolution of life itself, especially plants, can influence atmospheric composition. One particularly important factor is carbon. Plants absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen. When vast forests spread across continents, they draw down atmospheric carbon over time. When those forests are buried, burned, or destroyed, carbon is realized back into the system. Antarctica's forests, long gone, were part of this planetary balancing act. As Antarctica cooled and ice advanced, those forests disappeared. Carbon storage shifted, albedo increased, the planet cooled further. This cascading process transformed not just Antarctica, but global climate patterns. Ice sheets influenced sea level, wind circulation, and ocean chemistry. A frozen Antarctica helped shape the ice ages that later affected human evolution elsewhere. This connection between Antarctica and the rest of the world is often underestimated. The southern continent is not a passive participant in Earth's climate. It is a driver. Its freezing altered ocean circulation globally, intensifying temperature contrasts and contributing to the glacial cycles that defined much of the last few million years. From this perspective, Antarctica's lost warmth becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a missing piece in the story of how the modern world emerged. If Antarctica had remained warm, Earth's climate would be profoundly different. Sea levels would be higher. Weather patterns would shift. Human history itself might look nothing like it does now. Now consider what happens when we place early humans into this evolving system. Humans did not emerge in a stable climate. They evolved during a time of increasing variability. Ice ages came and went. Habitats expanded and contracted. Groups migrated, adapted, and sometimes vanished. Survival favored flexibility, memory, and cooperation. A warmer Antarctica earlier in Earth's history does not mean humans lived there then, but it does suggest that when humans eventually emerged, the planet they inherited carried the imprint of that lost warmth. Coastlines shaped by earlier seas, soils formed under ancient forests, geological features sculpted by rivers long frozen. These inherited landscapes influenced where humans could go and what resources they found. There is also a deeper implication. Climate change erases selectively. Warm, wet conditions tend to preserve organic material poorly. Cold, dry conditions preserve it better, but only if ice remains stable. Moving ice destroys more than it saves. Antarctica's transition to ice would have erased much of its own past, while preserving fragments elsewhere carried by migrating species or drifting sediments. Sediment cores drilled from beneath the ocean floor surrounding Antarctica contain layered records of these changes. Each layer holds chemical signatures that reflect temperature, vegetation, and ice volume. Isotopes of oxygen and carbon act as proxies, allowing scientists to reconstruct ancient climates with surprising accuracy. These records confirm repeated warm intervals and gradual cooling, not an eternal deep freeze. Lost warmth also reshapes our understanding of polar light. Today, polar regions experience extreme contrast between summer and winter daylight. But under warmer conditions with cloud cover and vegetation, those extremes would feel less severe. Light would be diffused, temperatures moderated. Life would organize itself around these rhythms, just as it does in modern high-latitude environments. If people had lived in such a place, their relationship with time and season would likely be different from those at lower latitudes. Long summer days would encourage bursts of activity. Winters would emphasize planning, storage, and social cohesion. These pressures could foster sophisticated environmental knowledge, astronomy, and storytelling. Tools essential for navigating a world defined by cycles. None of this requires imagining advanced technology or lost machines. It requires only people responding intelligently to their environment, as humans always have. Knowledge passed orally, skills refined through practice, traditions shaped by climate. These leave subtle traces often in myths, migration patterns, and shared symbols rather than stone ruins. The idea of green poles also challenges how we interpret ancient stories. Many cultures speak of a time when the world was different, when climates shifted dramatically, when lands were lost or transformed. These stories are often dismissed as exaggerations, but some may encode real environmental memories passed down across generations. A civilization does not need to remember its origin precisely to carry echoes of it. Memory compresses, distorts, and mythologizes. A lost southern homeland could become a symbolic place rather than a geographic one. Over time, direction itself could blur, especially if descendants migrated northward for many generations. When the poles were green, Earth was a quieter place in some ways. There were no permanent ice caps amplifying climate swings. Heat moved more freely. Ecosystems were broader and less fragmented. As the planet cooled, life retreated into refuges, adapting to harsher conditions. Humans emerged during this contraction phase, inheriting a world already shaped by loss. Understanding that context reframes the question of origins. Instead of asking why, we have no evidence of early civilization in Antarctica. We might ask whether Antarctica's transformation played a role in scattering populations, reshaping habitats, and concentrating human activity elsewhere. The center does not always remain the center. Sometimes it dissolves, leaving its influence diffused across the map. The poles were not always barren. They were once alive, dynamic, and connected to the rest of the world in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. And once that is acknowledged, the question of who might have known that world becomes harder to ignore. When we talk about the first humans, the conversation almost always points in one direction, out of Africa, northward, eastward, across land bridges and coastlines that we can still trace on maps today. This narrative feels solid because it is supported by genetics, fossils, and archaeology. Yet even solid narratives can leave certain questions untouched, especially when those questions are not about where humans went, but about how we decide which way movement is supposed to make sense. Direction is a surprisingly powerful assumption. North feels like progress. South feels like retreat. These are not scientific conclusions. They are habits reinforced by maps, language, and cultural momentum. When early humans are discussed, movement is usually described as an outward expansion from a central birthplace into colder, more difficult regions. But that framing already assumes we know where the center was, and that assumption is shaped by where evidence survived best. Human fossils preserve well in some environments and poorly in others. Dry caves, stable sediments, and regions without heavy glaciation are generous to archaeology. Wet environments, forests, coastlines, and regions later covered by ice or not. This uneven preservation creates a map of human history that looks more certain than it actually is. We know where evidence exists. we are far less certain about where evidence may have existed and then vanished. When considering Antarctica, the question is not whether modern humans evolved there. There is no evidence for that, and no serious scientific claim suggests otherwise. The question is subtler. It asks whether Antarctica could have played a role in early human movement, memory, or orientation long before recorded history, and whether our concept of direction itself might be inherited from a world that no longer exists. To explore that, it helps to look at how early humans understood space. Modern humans rely on abstract coordinate systems: latitude, longitude, north, south, east, west. These are tools layered on top of a deeper, more instinctive sense of direction based on landmarks, seasons, stars, and terrain. For most of human history, direction was relational, not absolute. You move toward water, toward warmth, toward food, toward familiar routes. In such a system, north is meaningless unless it is defined by something experienced. If you live near the equator, north and south feel interchangeable. If you live near a pole, direction becomes radial. Everything leads away from you. That alone reshapes how movement is perceived. Imagine a population living far south on a greener Antarctica during a warmer epoch. Their outward movement would not feel like heading north in a symbolic sense. It would simply feel like leaving home, traveling outward into new territories. Over generations, as climates cooled and conditions worsened, movement away from the southern regions would become a necessity rather than a choice. In that scenario, migration would not be framed as expansion into opportunity, but retreat from loss, retreat from cold, from shrinking ecosystems, from changing seasons that no longer supported life as they once had. This changes the emotional and cultural tone of migration. Instead of heroic exploration, it becomes preservation. Instead of conquest, continuity. Anthropological studies of displaced populations show that forced migration leaves deep cultural marks. People remember where they came from even when the physical place becomes unreachable. The memory may not remain geographically precise, but it persists as story, symbol, or sacred origin. Over time, direction itself can acquire meaning tied to that memory. This may help explain why many ancient cultures attach special significance to cardinal directions. North is often associated with cold, darkness, or danger. South with warmth or origin. These associations vary, but they are not random. They reflect lived experience passed down long after the original conditions have changed. Now consider early human movement patterns as we understand them today. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. Over tens of thousands of years, population spread outward. Some moved along coastlines. Others followed rivers and grasslands. Eventually, humans reached every continent except Antarctica, or so the story goes. But that story is constrained by time frames tied to modern ice conditions. Antarctica has been uninhabitable for humans throughout the period when Homo sapiens existed. That does not mean it was irrelevant. It means it may have shaped movement indirectly by influencing climate, sea level, and available routes elsewhere. During glacial periods, massive ice sheets locked up water, lowering sea levels. This exposed continental shelves and land bridges. Routes that are now underwater once connected regions directly. Australia was reachable from Southeast Asia. The Americas were connected to Siberia. Southern land masses were closer together. If Antarctica had once been warmer earlier still before the final locking in of ice, it could have functioned as a hub rather than a dead end. Not for Homo sapiens as we know them, but for earlier hominins or even prehuman populations whose existence we barely understand. Human evolution did not begin with a single species. It involved multiple branches, experiments, and dead ends. The fossil record already shows that hominins were more widespread than once believed. Tools appear earlier, and farther afield than expected. Human ancestors adapted to diverse environments long before modern humans appeared. It is not unreasonable to imagine that some of these populations explored southern regions that later became inaccessible. Direction also intersects with navigation. Early humans navigated by the sky as much as by land. The stars provide reliable orientation, especially in regions with clear seasonal patterns. Near the poles, the sky behaves differently. Constellations circle the horizon rather than rising and setting. The concept of a fixed North Star becomes less useful. Instead, orientation depends on the sun's path and seasonal light. If a culture developed in such an environment, its astronomical knowledge would differ from that of equatorial or mid-latitude societies. Their myths, symbols, and calendars would reflect long days, long nights, and circular motion rather than linear progression. Traces of this kind of thinking might survive in symbolic systems long after the original environment was abandoned. Some researchers have noted curious similarities in ancient symbolism across distant cultures. Circles, spirals, radial designs, emphasis on cycles rather than straight lines. While these can arise independently, they may also reflect shared ways of interpreting the world shaped by similar environmental pressures. The question of direction also appears in language. Many ancient languages encode spatial relationships differently than modern ones. Some describe direction relative to landscape features rather than cardinal points. Others embed orientation into verbs and grammar. These linguistic structures preserve how speakers understood movement and place. If a population migrated northward over many generations, the meaning of south might shift. It could become symbolic rather than practical. South as origin, south as past. South is a place that exists more in story than in geography. Over time, maps would invert that meaning, placing north at the top, reinforcing a new sense of centrality. Maps themselves are a late invention. For most of history, the world was not visualized from above. It was experienced from within. Centers were defined by familiarity, not coordinates. The idea that civilization must radiate from the middle of a flat projection is a modern habit imposed backward onto ancient lives. When we ask why early humans moved the way they did, we often focus on resources and climate. These are essential factors, but they do not tell the whole story. Movement is also shaped by memory, fear, and tradition. People follow paths that others have walked before. They avoid places associated with danger or loss. If a southern homeland became unlivable, it might acquire a taboo quality, remembered but not revisited. This could help explain why Antarctica feels absent from human mythology compared to other lost lands. It may have disappeared too completely. Flooded lands like those under the North Sea left visible shallows and oral histories. Antarctica was sealed off, cut away, and transformed beyond recognition. Memory without access fades faster. The first humans, however defined, were not guided by compasses. They were guided by survival. Direction was not ideological. It was pragmatic. Yet over time, pragmatism crystallizes into tradition. Roots become stories. Stories become identity. Identity shapes future movement long after the original reason is forgotten. There is also the question of return. Many migrations are one way, not because return is impossible, but because return is no longer desirable. Once a place no longer supports life, going back becomes unthinkable. This does not erase attachment. It transforms it. Home becomes something you carry rather than something you visit. From this angle, the absence of evidence for early humans in Antarctica becomes less puzzling. If Antarctica's role was transitional, a place left behind rather than built up, its material footprint might have been light, temporary shelters, seasonal camps, movement rather than permanence. These leave few traces, even under ideal conditions. As ice advanced, whatever remained would be crushed, buried, or erased. Later populations elsewhere would inherit skills, stories, and directional habits without inheriting the place itself. Over time, origins blur. Africa becomes the earliest visible center because evidence survived there, not necessarily because nothing existed elsewhere. This does not undermine the importance of Africa in human evolution. Africa is central, rich, and foundational. It simply leaves room for complexity. Evolution is not a straight line radiating outward. It is a branching process with overlaps, retreats, and forgotten corridors. The question of direction also invites us to reconsider what we mean by first. First to build cities, first to farm, first to write. These milestones define civilization narrowly. Human history includes far more subtle achievements. Navigation, seasonal planning, knowledge transmission, environmental adaptation. These often arise long before monumental structures. If early populations developed such skills in southern regions, those skills could have traveled north even as the land itself became inaccessible. In that case, Antarctica's contribution would be invisible yet influential, a silent ancestor rather than a visible monument. Long before satellites traced coastlines with clinical precision, and before Antarctica became a blank white shape at the bottom of every classroom globe, maps were something very different. They were not neutral tools. They were stories stitched together from memory, rumor, travel, and inheritance. A map was less a snapshot of the world and more a conversation across generations. A way of saying this is what we think lies beyond the horizon. And sometimes those conversations include details that feel unsettlingly out of place. When people first encounter the Piri Reis Map, their reaction is often a quiet pause rather than immediate disbelief. The map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and seaographer named Piri Reis, depicts parts of Europe, Africa, and South America with surprising accuracy for its time. That alone is impressive, but not mysterious. What draws sustained attention is what appears to be shown at the bottom of the map. A southern land mass drawn with confidence, featuring coastlines that some believe resemble Antarctica, not as we know it today, but as it might appear without ice. Piri Reis himself did not claim originality. In the notes written directly onto the map, he explains that he compiled it from older sources. Some came from Portuguese and Arabic maps. Others, he says, came from much earlier charts, including those attributed to Alexander the Great's era. He describes using around 20 source maps layered together to form a single image. The implication is clear. Whatever knowledge appears on the map did not originate in the 16th century. It was inherited. This alone is not controversial. Seagraphers have always built on previous work. What complicates things is the nature of what seems to be inherited. Antarctica, officially discovered in the 19th century, should not appear on a 16th century map at all. Yet there it is, at least according to some interpretations. And not just a vague suggestion of land, but a coastline that appears detailed and deliberate. Skeptics point out that the southern landmass could simply be an extension of South America, distorted by projection errors common in early maps. This is a reasonable explanation, and one that deserves consideration. Early seaographers often struggled with longitude, leading to stretched or compressed landforms. South America itself was poorly understood at the time, and its southern tip was still a mystery. Yet even accounting for distortion, certain features remain odd. The coastline curves in ways that do not align neatly with South America's known geography. Some segments appear smoother, less jagged, more consistent with ice-free land. There are also inland features that resemble river systems, something that would be difficult to observe beneath ice. More puzzling still is the suggestion that the map depicts Antarctica before it was covered by ice. Modern surveys using radar have revealed that Antarctica's bedrock coastline beneath the ice differs significantly from the visible ice edge. In some cases, the Piri Reis Map appears to align more closely with this hidden coastline than with the modern one. That alignment is not perfect, and it is debated, but it exists often enough to raise eyebrows rather than dismissals. The Piri Reis Map is not alone. Other early maps include southern land masses, labeled with names that suggest familiarity rather than speculation. Terms like Terra Australis Incognita appear repeatedly implying not just a theoretical southern continent, but one expected to exist based on inherited knowledge. These lands are not always drawn vaguely. Some are given mountain ranges, rivers, and coastlines. One particularly intriguing example is the Piri Reis Map from 1531. This map shows a large southern continent with detailed geography, including what appear to be river systems flowing inland. Antarctica today has no surface rivers of this scale. But beneath the ice, ancient river valleys exist, carved long before glaciation. Once again, the question arises, how would a 16th century seagrapher know this? Charles Hap Good, a 20th century scholar, brought renewed attention to these maps. He proposed that they were derived from an ancient source civilization with advanced geographic knowledge. His ideas were controversial and remain so. Mainstream academia has not accepted his conclusions, and many criticisms of his methodology are valid. Still, even critics acknowledge that the maps themselves are real and that their origins are complex. It is tempting to jump from puzzling maps to grand conclusions, but restraint is important. Maps can deceive. Projection errors, symbolic representations, and artistic conventions all complicate interpretation. Yet, dismissing these maps outright also requires assumptions. It assumes that all apparent accuracy is coincidence, that all inherited sources were recent, and that no ancient geographic knowledge could survive fragmentation. Survival of knowledge is not hypothetical. We know it happens. Babylonian astronomical records preserve data spanning centuries. Indigenous oral traditions accurately record geological events thousands of years old, such as volcanic eruptions and sea level rise. Knowledge does not require writing to persist. It requires repetition, relevance, and care. Maps, in this sense, are a form of condensed memory. They compress information gathered over long periods into visual shorthand. A coastline may represent generations of seafaring experience rather than a single voyage. If an ancient culture had access to southern regions during a warmer epoch, its geographic memory could persist long after the land itself became inaccessible. There is also the matter of scale. Ancient maps were not intended to be used the way modern ones are. They were navigational aids, symbolic guides, or political statements. Accuracy was often regional rather than global. A map maker might depict a familiar coastline precisely, while leaving distant lands approximate. This uneven precision can make certain areas appear strangely accurate when viewed centuries later. Critics often argue that interpreting these maps through a modern lens imposes expectations they were never meant to meet. That is true, but the reverse is also true. Ignoring consistent anomalies because they do not fit modern expectations can limit inquiry. The maps invite questions even if they do not provide answers. Another point often overlooked is the role of lost libraries. History is filled with references to collections of knowledge that no longer exist. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous, but it was not unique. Knowledge was gathered, copied, summarized, and sometimes lost repeatedly. Each loss created gaps that later generations could not easily recognize. If ancient geographic knowledge existed, it may have survived only in fragments, a coastline copied without context, a latitude preserved without explanation. Over time, these fragments would be absorbed into new maps, stripped of their original meaning, yet still present. The idea that Antarctica could have been known to ancient peoples does not require global exploration, as we imagine it today. It requires only that someone at some time reached southern latitudes under different climatic conditions. Lower sea ice, milder temperatures, and different ocean currents could make such travel feasible. Early humans and prehumans were capable of long-distance movement along coasts, especially when resources were predictable. What feels impossible now may not have been then. Modern Antarctica is isolated by violent seas and ice shelves. A warmer Antarctica with accessible coastlines and seasonal ice-free waters would present a very different challenge. Not easy, but not unimaginable. Maps also reflect power. What is included matters. What is excluded matters just as much. European maps gradually erased southern lands as Antarctica became unreachable. Blank spaces replaced confident lines. Terra Australis faded into abstraction. Knowledge can be lost not because it is wrong, but because it is no longer useful. Once Antarctica froze completely, there was no reason to sail there. Trade routes shifted. Attention moved north. Knowledge decayed. By the time Europeans began systematic exploration, the southern continent was effectively rediscovered, not encountered for the first time. There is a quiet irony here. Modern science now uses technology to peer beneath Antarctica's ice, revealing landscapes hidden for millions of years. Mountains, valleys, and coastlines emerge on screens, confirming that the continent is far more complex than its surface suggests. In doing so, science is rediscovering features that ancient maps may have hinted at without understanding fully. This does not mean those maps were based on satellites or advanced instruments. It means they may reflect cumulative human experience during periods when the environment allowed access. Experience does not require theory. Sailors do not need to understand plate tectonics to know where land lies. Another layer to consider is symbolic geography. Some maps blend physical and mythic space. A southern land might represent balance, symmetry, or expectation rather than a surveyed coast. Ancient thinkers often believed the world required harmony. A large northern land implied a southern counterpart. Terra Australis could be drawn to satisfy philosophical ideas as much as observational ones. Yet even symbolic ideas often grow from something tangible. A concept repeated across cultures usually has roots in experience, even if distorted over time. Complete inventions rarely persist for centuries without reinforcement. The Piri Reis Map sits at the intersection of all these possibilities. It is not a smoking gun. It is not proof of an ancient Antarctic civilization. It is a puzzle, one of several. Its value lies in what it unsettles rather than what it confirms. When you look at that map, what stands out is not precision alone, but confidence. The southern land is not tentative. It is drawn as something expected to exist. That expectation had to come from somewhere. Even if it was wrong in detail, it was persistent enough to be inherited. As we gather these puzzles, a pattern begins to form. Not a conclusion, but a tension. The official timeline says Antarctica entered human awareness very late. The map suggests a more complicated story of knowledge appearing, disappearing, and reappearing under different names. This tension mirrors what we see elsewhere in history. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge accumulates and fragments. Later cultures rediscover ideas once known and forgotten. The past is not a straight line of progress. It is layered, uneven, and full of erasers. Maps that should not exist force us to confront those eras. They remind us that absence in the record does not always mean absence in reality. Sometimes it means the record itself has been trimmed, burned, or buried. Let the image of those old maps linger. Ink lines drawn centuries ago, tracing lands no one alive had seen, copied from sources even older. Whether coincidence, distortion, or inheritance, they hint at a world more interconnected than our timelines suggest, and they quietly prepare us for the next question. If physical evidence can be erased by ice and time, where else might traces of a lost southern path survive? Memory does not disappear all at once. It thins, it stretches, it sheds details while holding on to shapes, emotions, and directions long after the original place has vanished. When landscapes change faster than stories can adapt, what remains is not a map but a feeling. This is where the idea of a forgotten homeland begins to take form. Not as a pinpoint on a globe, but as a presence at the edge of collective awareness. Human groups have always carried more than tools when they migrate. They carry explanations why they left, what was lost, what should never be forgotten. These explanations do not stay factual for long. They soften into narratives that help people make sense of dislocation. Over generations, a homeland left behind becomes idealized, simplified, or transformed into something symbolic. It stops being a location you can return to and becomes a reference point for identity. Anthropologists see this pattern repeatedly. Nomadic groups remember places their grandparents never saw. Island cultures tell stories of lands now submerged. Indigenous communities preserve accounts of floods, fires, and cold periods that align with geological evidence thousands of years old. Memory, when reinforced through ritual and story, can outlast physical access by astonishing margins. If a population once lived in southern regions that later became inaccessible, that loss would not simply erase the place from awareness. It would reshape how it was remembered. The homeland might be spoken of as a place of origin rather than residence, as something behind rather than around. Over time, its geographic reality would blur, but its emotional weight could persist. One of the striking features of ancient mythologies across widely separated cultures is the recurrence of lost lands. Sometimes they are described as sunken, sometimes frozen, sometimes destroyed by fire or flood. The specifics differ, but the structure is similar. There was once a place where things began, where life was ordered differently, and from which people were scattered due to forces beyond their control. These stories are often dismissed as allegory. In some cases, they clearly are. Yet, allegory itself usually grows from lived experience. People do not invent loss in detail unless loss has meaning. Myths exaggerate, compress, and moralize, but they rarely arise from nothing. A southern homeland is a recurring motif that rarely receives sustained attention because it conflicts with modern geography. The North dominates historical narratives. Writing systems, monuments, and empires that survived into recorded history are overwhelmingly northern. As a result, southward origins feel counterintuitive, almost backwards. Yet direction is a cultural construct. For much of human history, there was no inherent reason to privilege north over south. That preference emerged alongside navigation technologies, seagraphy, and political power structures centered in the northern hemisphere. Earlier cultures may have oriented themselves differently, especially if their ancestral memory pointed elsewhere. Consider how origin stories function. They are not neutral histories. They explain why the world is the way it is now. If a people experience gradual environmental decline in their homeland, followed by migration and adaptation elsewhere, their stories would frame that movement as necessary, perhaps even divinely guided. The old land might become sacred, forbidden, or unreachable, reinforcing separation. In that process, precise geography becomes less important than moral geography. The homeland becomes associated with abundance, order, or wisdom. The new land becomes a place of trial, growth, or struggle. This pattern appears in countless traditions, regardless of actual location. If Antarctica played any role at all in early human memory, it would likely appear in this symbolic form, not as Antarctica, but as a place of long days, strange light, or distant cold. It might be remembered as the land before seasons shifted, before the world hardened. Language offers subtle clues here. Words for past, origin, or ancestors often overlap in meaning. In some cultures, the word for behind also means before. The past is spatially located, somewhere you cannot see directly. If a homeland lay physically behind migrating populations, that linguistic overlap would reinforce its placement in memory. There is also the phenomenon of directional taboo. Certain directions become avoided, associated with danger or death. If southern regions became progressively colder and more hostile, stories might caution against returning. Over time, this avoidance could harden into myth, warning of monsters, endless night, or uninhabitable land. This would not require a sudden catastrophe. Gradual cooling can be just as displacing. As resources diminish, populations move incrementally, leaving fewer people behind each generation. Eventually, no one remains who remembers the place directly. Memory survives only through story. Archaeology struggles with this kind of absence. It is designed to recover material culture, not emotional geography. When people leave lightly and do not return, they leave little behind. Temporary structures decay. Organic materials vanish. What remains is silence, easily mistaken for non-existence. Ice intensifies that silence. Unlike erosion, which exposes layers over time, ice buries and compresses. It does not reveal, it conceals. A homeland lost to ice is not just abandoned, it is sealed. Modern humans are accustomed to thinking of memory as something stored in archives, books, or databases. Ancient memory worked differently. It lived in repetition. Songs, rituals, and seasonal practices reinforced shared understanding. As long as those practices continued, memory remained active. When environments change, practices change with them. A ritual tied to a particular landscape feature loses relevance once that feature is gone. The story might survive, but its context fades. Eventually, only fragments remain, detached from their original meaning. This fragmentation is visible in comparative mythology. Similar themes appear in distant cultures, but details diverge. Flood myths differ in cause and outcome. Creation stories emphasize different elements, yet the core structure persists, suggesting a shared experiential root rather than direct contact. A forgotten homeland at the edge of memory would produce exactly this pattern. Not a single coherent narrative, but echoes, familiar shapes appearing in unfamiliar forms, a sense of loss without a name. Some researchers have noted that early cosmologies often place a significant land or axis at the center of the world. This center is not always equatorial. Sometimes it is polar. In these systems, the world rotates around a fixed point, often associated with stability or origin. As climates shifted and populations moved, that center would no longer align with lived experience. New centers would emerge, old ones would recede into abstraction. The world's axis might become a metaphor rather than a location. This transition can be traced in the way sacred geography evolves. Early sacred sites are often natural features, mountains, springs, groves. Later, sacredness becomes attached to constructed places, temples, cities, monuments. This shift mirrors the move from direct environmental engagement to symbolic representation. If a southern homeland existed and was lost, its sacredness might survive only in displaced form. A mountain elsewhere might stand in for an older one. A ritual might be performed facing a direction rather than a place. Facing direction itself is telling. Many rituals emphasize orientation. Facing east at sunrise, facing north for burial, facing a particular point during prayer. These practices embed memory into the body, even when the original reason is forgotten. A population migrating northward might continue to orient certain practices southward, long after the physical meaning was gone. Over time, explanations would be invented. The direction would remain significant, but its origin would be obscured. This is how memory survives without clarity. It becomes habit rather than history. Meaning persists even when explanation fails. From a modern perspective, this can look like superstition or coincidence. From a long-term human perspective, it is continuity. The past exerting pressure on the present in subtle ways. It is important not to romanticize this process. A forgotten homeland is not a golden age preserved intact. Memory distorts. It simplifies. It selects. What survives is what serves identity, not accuracy. That does not make it worthless. It makes it human. If Antarctica was ever part of humanity's deep past, its legacy would almost certainly exist in this indirect form. Not in clear records or monuments, but in directional preferences, mythic structures, and shared patterns of thought. This would explain why the idea feels both compelling and elusive. There is nothing concrete to point to, yet something seems to hover just beyond reach. The sense that something was once there, important enough to leave traces, but altered enough to resist reconstruction. The scientific tools improve. Physical traces beneath ice may one day offer clearer answers. But memory operates on a different timeline. It does not wait for proof. It adapts to absence. Moving forward, the question becomes how such memory might intersect with physical evidence. If Antarctica holds a buried past, how might fragments of that past have influenced cultures elsewhere? What would survive migration, climate change, and time itself? Beneath the surface of Antarctica lies one of the most unusual archives on Earth. Not because it was designed to preserve history, but because it unintentionally sealed it away. Ice does not behave like soil or sand. It does not gently accumulate and allow layers to rest undisturbed. It flows. It compresses. It erases some things completely while locking others away so thoroughly that they become unreachable rather than destroyed. This makes Antarctica less like a museum and more like a vault, difficult to open and easy to misunderstand. When people hear the phrase "buried beneath the ice," they often imagine artifacts frozen neatly in place, waiting to be uncovered like insects in amber. The reality is far more complicated. Antarctica's ice sheet is in places more than 4 km thick. Under that weight, the land below is under immense pressure. Mountains are flattened, valleys are deepened. Anything left on the surface before glaciation would have been subjected to grinding forces over millions of years. And yet, ice does preserve certain things extraordinarily well, just not in obvious ways. Ice cores drilled from Antarctica contain detailed records of Earth's climate stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Tiny bubbles trapped inside those cores preserve ancient air, allowing scientists to measure atmospheric composition from long before humans existed. Volcanic ash layers are preserved with precision. Chemical signatures remain readable across vast time scales. This tells us something important. Ice is selective. It destroys large, fragile structures exposed to movement, but it preserves information at smaller scales with remarkable fidelity. That selectivity shapes what could still exist below. If any traces of early human or prehuman presence ever existed in Antarctica, they would not look like cities or monuments. Those expectations come from regions where stone architecture survived erosion and exposure. A southern environment dominated by organic materials, wood, plant fibers, and temporary shelters would leave behind a very different signature, one that is much easier to erase. Glacial movement is relentless. As ice thickens, it begins to flow outward under its own weight, dragging debris along the bedrock. Rocks embedded in the ice act like sandpaper. Over time, entire landscapes are scoured. Anything left in the open is ground down, fragmented and redistributed. But not all areas experience the same level of destruction. Some regions beneath the ice are surprisingly stable. Subglacial lakes exist, sealed beneath kiln of ice, yet remaining liquid due to geothermal heat and pressure. Lake Vosto is the most famous, but it is not alone. Dozens of such lakes have been identified, connected by networks of water channels beneath the ice. These environments have been isolated for millions of years. Whatever entered them before they were sealed would remain protected from surface erosion. This has profound implications for biology, which is why scientists are so cautious when drilling into them. Introducing surface microbes could contaminate ecosystems that evolved independently for immense spans of time. From an archaeological perspective, these subglacial regions raise difficult questions. If a warmer Antarctica once supported rivers, lakes, and coastlines, then early habitation would most likely cluster near water, just as it does everywhere else. When ice advanced, those same regions would be the first to be buried. Some would be crushed, others might be sealed. The challenge is access. Modern drilling technology is expensive, slow, and constrained by environmental protections. Antarctica is governed by international treaties that prioritize scientific research and environmental preservation. Digging indiscriminately in search of hypothetical ruins is neither feasible nor ethical. Even when drilling occurs, it targets narrow cores rather than broad excavation. Archaeology thrives on context. A single artifact without surrounding information tells very little. Ice cores provide incredible data about climate, but they are ill-suited for detecting cultural remains unless those remains are unmistakably present. There is also the issue of expectation bias. Researchers drill looking for specific signals: greenhouse gases, isotopes, volcanic ash. They are not looking for charcoal from ancient fires or traces of habitation. Even if such traces were present in minute quantities, they could easily be overlooked or dismissed as contamination. Satellite imaging has revealed much about Antarctica's hidden geography. Mountain ranges rivaling the Alps lie buried beneath ice. Deep valleys suggest long-lived river systems. Some features resemble landscapes shaped by sustained surface water rather than brief melting events. These discoveries confirm that Antarctica once had a dynamic surface environment. What they do not confirm is human presence, and that distinction matters. Curiosity must not be confused with evidence. At the same time, absence of evidence under kiln of ice is not equivalent to evidence of absence. One of the more intriguing possibilities involves coastal margins. Antarctica's coastline has changed dramatically over time. Ice shelves advance and retreat. Sea levels rise and fall. During warmer periods, large stretches of coast would have been exposed and habitable. When ice returned, these same areas would have been submerged or buried. Submerged archaeology already poses challenges elsewhere in the world. Vast areas of early human habitation lie underwater on continental shelves. Only recently have technologies allowed limited exploration of these drowned landscapes. Antarctica adds an additional layer of difficulty by placing ice on top of water on top of land. Any remains in these zones would be deeply inaccessible. Not destroyed necessarily, but beyond current reach. This creates a skewed picture of human history, where accessible regions appear central simply because they can be studied. It is worth noting that Antarctica is not the only place where ice has erased human traces. Large portions of North America and Europe were covered by ice sheets during the last glacial maximum. Entire landscapes were reshaped. Evidence of early human activity in those regions is sparse compared to areas that remained ice-free. Yet humans were there. We know this because traces appear at the margins. Tools, campsites, migration corridors. The core areas once under ice remain largely silent. Scale matters here. The Antarctic ice sheet is far larger and older than the ice sheets that covered northern continents. Its erasing power is proportionally greater. Expecting clear archaeological signatures under such conditions is unrealistic. Another factor often overlooked is time depth. Human history spans hundreds of thousands of years. Antarctic glaciation spans tens of millions. Any interaction between the two would be compressed into a narrow window. If that window closed gradually, evidence would be sparse even before ice advanced. The idea of ice as a time capsule is therefore misleading if taken literally. It is not a box storing intact objects. It is a filter. It preserves certain signals while obliterating others. It favors chemistry over culture, molecules over meaning. That does not mean culture leaves no trace. Fire alters soil chemistry. Repeated human presence changes vegetation patterns. Even small populations can influence local ecosystems in detectable ways. If such signals exist beneath Antarctic ice, they would be subtle and difficult to distinguish from natural variation. Future technologies may change this. Improved remote sensing, deeper radar penetration, and more refined chemical analysis could one day identify anomalies suggestive of past human activity. But interpretation would remain cautious. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, especially in environments as complex as this. There is also a psychological dimension to buried landscapes. Humans tend to assume that what cannot be seen does not exist. Antarctica reinforces that bias. Its surface appears empty, so we project emptiness backward in time. Ice becomes not just a physical barrier, but a conceptual one. Breaking through that barrier requires reframing. Instead of asking what should be visible, it is more productive to ask what would realistically survive. The answer is rarely stone walls or tools neatly arranged. It is altered sediment layers, unusual chemical ratios, disrupted ecological timelines. Such evidence does not announce itself clearly. It requires hypotheses to be formed before searches begin. Without a reason to look, nothing is found. This creates a circular problem. No evidence leads to no searches, which leads to continued absence. Science advances by breaking such loops carefully, not recklessly. The idea that Antarctica could hold buried traces of a forgotten human past is not a conclusion. It is a question about what ice does to history. Ice freezes motion, but only after reshaping what it covers. It locks in climate records while grinding landscapes flat. It preserves air but destroys architecture. It remembers the atmosphere while forgetting footsteps. That duality makes Antarctica unique. It is simultaneously one of the best records of Earth's past and one of the worst places to look for human stories. This tension explains why the idea of something buried there feels both compelling and frustrating. If anything human-related exists beneath the ice, it will not resemble expectations shaped by Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Andes. It would be fragmentary, indirect, and ambiguous. It would demand interpretation rather than recognition. This leads to an uncomfortable realization. Our understanding of human history is biased toward places where ice did not go. Antarctica forces us to confront how much of the past may be missing. Not because it never happened, but because Earth itself erased the traces. Stories often survive longer than landscapes. When land sinks, freezes, or becomes unreachable, what remains is not geography but narrative. This is especially true for places that vanish gradually rather than violently. They slip away from daily life while staying lodged in cultural memory, reshaped each time they're told. The farther back you go, the more geography dissolves into myth. And yet, the persistence of certain locations in those myths raises an unavoidable question. Why do so many traditions separated by oceans and millennia speak of a lost land tied to the far edges of the world? One of the most frequently cited examples is Hyperoria. In ancient Greek thought, Hyperoria was not simply a fictional paradise. It was placed deliberately beyond the north wind, beyond Boreas in a region of perpetual light and abundance. Hyperorians were said to live long lives untouched by hardship, disease, or war. They were close to the gods, especially Apollo, who was believed to travel there seasonally. At first glance, Hyperoria seems firmly northern, the opposite of Antarctica. But when examined carefully, its defining features are not direction-specific. They're environmental. Long days, extended light cycles, a land removed from ordinary seasonal hardship. These characteristics can apply to polar regions in general, north or south, especially during periods of different axial tilt or climate conditions. Greek geographers themselves were inconsistent about Hyperoria's placement. Some placed it north of the known world. Others associated it with the edges of the inhabited Earth without firm orientation. As geographic knowledge expanded, Hyperoria receded rather than disappeared, suggesting it was tied less to coordinates and more to an inherited idea of an unreachable origin. Plato's Atlantis occupies a different position in this web of stories. Atlantis is described as a technologically advanced society that existed before recorded history and was destroyed in a single catastrophic event. Plato places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which modern readers associate with the Strait of Gibraltar. This has led to endless speculation about its location, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic to the Caribbean. What is often overlooked is that Plato's account emphasizes not location alone, but age. Atlantis belonged to a deep past, older than the civilizations Plato knew. It was presented as a counterpoint, a reminder that advanced societies could rise and fall long before Greece ever existed. Its destruction marked a turning point, a loss that reshaped the world. The mechanism of Atlantis's disappearance, sudden flooding, align with memories of rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Coastal regions worldwide were submerged. Entire landscapes vanished. For populations living near those coasts, the experience would be traumatic and unforgettable. But flooding is not the only way land can be lost. Freezing can be just as final if slower. A homeland rendered uninhabitable by advancing ice would produce similar cultural consequences. Migration, fragmentation, memory without access. Some traditions describe lost lands as cold rather than submerged. In Norse mythology, there is the idea of a primordial frozen realm, a place of origin tied to creation itself. In other traditions, the world begins in ice before fire brings change. These stories are symbolic, but symbols often arise from environmental realities familiar to the people telling them. In Hindu cosmology, there are references to ancient ages when climate and geography were profoundly different. Cycles of creation and destruction reshape the world repeatedly. Lands appear and disappear. Directions lose permanence. While these texts are not maps, they preserve the idea that the world humans inhabit now is not the first version of Earth. Indigenous traditions from the Southern Hemisphere are often excluded from discussions of polar myth, but they deserve attention. Australian Aboriginal stories contain accounts of a time before the current coastline existed, when land extended farther south and the sea rose later. These stories have been shown to align with geological evidence of sea level rise thousands of years ago. In South America, some Andean traditions speak of an earlier world age destroyed by cold and darkness. Survivors emerge into a changed landscape and must rebuild. Again, the emphasis is not on precise geography, but on environmental transformation. What links these stories is not consistency of detail, but consistency of structure. There is an earlier world. It is different from the present one. It is lost due to natural forces. Humanity survives by moving, adapting, and remembering imperfectly. The South plays an interesting role in many of these narratives. It is often associated with origin, depth, or antiquity. In some cultures, ancestors are said to come from the South. In others, sacred knowledge is believed to have traveled northward. This pattern becomes more intriguing when considered alongside climate history. As the planet cooled, habitable zones shifted northward. Populations followed resources. Over long periods, this movement would feel directional, even inevitable. South becomes associated with before, north with after. Language reinforces this. In some linguistic traditions, the words for past and behind overlap. The past is something you have moved away from, not something in front of you. If migration followed a general northward trend over millennia, that spatial metaphor would align naturally. Hyperborea, Atlantis, and similar legends may therefore be less about specific lost cities and more about inherited orientation. They encode the idea that the world once had a different center, that humanity did not always live where it does now, that something important lies beyond the boundaries of current experience. This does not require a single global civilization or shared myth. It requires only that multiple groups experience similar environmental disruptions and preserve those experiences in story. Ice advancing, seas rising, familiar lands becoming unreachable. Over time, these memories detach from their original settings. They become universal stories rather than local histories. A frozen homeland might be remembered as a golden age. A flooded coast might become a moral warning. A long migration might turn into a divine journey. Modern readers often expect myths to function like flawed historical records waiting to be decoded. That expectation misses their real purpose. Myths are not trying to preserve dates or coordinates. They preserve meaning. They explain why the world feels the way it does. From that perspective, polar legends are not evidence in the strict sense. They are signals. They point toward repeated human experiences of loss and displacement tied to environmental change. The problem arises when we assume that myths must refer to places we can still locate. Some places no longer exist in any meaningful way. Antarctica transformed beyond recognition fits that category. If it ever played a role in human memory, it would not survive as a name on a map. It would survive as a pattern of thought. There is also the matter of erasure. As dominant civilizations rise, they reinterpret inherited stories through their own geography. A southern origin becomes northern in retelling. A polar land shifts position to fit known maps. This happens unconsciously as storytellers adapt narratives to their audience's understanding of the world. Greek writers, for example, could not place Hyperborea south of the Mediterranean because their world ended there. Their south was Africa. Their north was mystery. So mystery went north. This does not mean the original inspiration was northern. It means direction was reassigned as knowledge changed. The same process likely occurred repeatedly. As people migrated, settled, and forgot, stories were re-anchored to new landscapes. The underlying memory persisted, but its compass shifted. This constant reorientation makes myths difficult to interpret literally. Yet it also makes them valuable for understanding how humans experience deep time. They are not static records. They are moving containers. If Antarctica once mattered to human history, myths are where its shadow would linger. Not clearly labeled, not easily extracted, but present in the repeated idea that something important was lost at the edges of the world. Myths of the South do not tell us where to dig. They tell us where to question. They remind us that human history is longer, messier, and more environmentally shaped than written records alone can capture. And once myth is placed alongside climate, migration, and buried landscapes, it becomes harder to dismiss the possibility that what feels like imagination may be carrying something older, quieter, and far less certain, but no less real for having slipped beyond the reach of maps. Look up at the sky from a place near the equator, and the heavens behave in a familiar way. Stars rise, cross overhead, and set. Constellations appear and disappear with the seasons. Time feels linear, marked by predictable cycles of night following day. But shift your position far enough south toward the bottom of the world, and that behavior begins to change in subtle but profound ways. The sky stops acting like a moving ribbon and starts behaving more like a turning wheel. And once that happens, the way people understand time, direction, and meaning can change with it. Astronomy is not just about distant objects. For most of human history, it was a practical tool woven into daily survival. The sky told people when to plant, when to travel, when animals would migrate, and when seasons were about to shift. It also offered something less tangible, but equally important, a sense of order. Patterns overhead suggested that the world followed rules, even when life on the ground felt uncertain. At high latitudes, especially near the poles, those patterns are dramatically different. Instead of stars rising and setting, many circle endlessly around a fixed point. Instead of a clear alternation between night and day, there are long stretches of continuous light or continuous darkness. The sun itself behaves strangely, skimming the horizon for weeks or months at a time. Modern people often experience this through documentaries or brief research expeditions. It feels alien, almost unsettling. But for a population living there long-term, this sky would not feel strange. It would feel normal. And normality shapes understanding. If Antarctica once supported human presence during a warmer epoch, astronomy would not have been optional knowledge. It would have been central. In an environment where seasonal extremes are pronounced, tracking the sky becomes essential. You cannot rely on temperature alone to signal change. You must anticipate it. The southern sky also presents constellations unfamiliar to northern observers. The Southern Cross, for example, does not rise or set in many southern locations. It rotates. Other star groups trace circular paths, reinforcing the idea of cycles rather than beginnings and endings. There is no clear start to the night sky. It simply turns. This rotational quality encourages a different mental framework. Time feels less like a line moving forward and more like a loop repeating itself. Events return. Seasons come back around. Nothing truly disappears. It only moves out of sight temporarily. Such a worldview aligns well with cyclical cosmologies found in many ancient traditions. Creation and destruction repeat. Ages rise and fall. The world renews itself rather than progressing toward a single endpoint. While this idea appears globally, it is particularly strong in cultures that experience dramatic seasonal repetition. Near the poles, the sun itself reinforces this cycle. During summer, it may never fully set. During winter, it may not rise at all. Day and night lose their usual meaning. Instead of thinking in terms of hours, people think in terms of phases. Light season, dark season return. If a population lived under such conditions, their astronomy would not focus on predicting sunrise tomorrow. It would focus on predicting the return of the sun months from now. This requires long-term observation and reliable memory. Tracking the sun's lowest and highest points on the horizon would become critical. Small changes would signal major transitions. Knowledge would be cumulative, passed down carefully because missing the timing could mean starvation. This kind of astronomical practice does not require writing or advanced instruments. It requires patience, observation, and continuity. All things humans are capable of when survival depends on them. Stone markers, wooden posts, or natural landmarks could be aligned with solar extremes. In temperate regions, such alignments survive as monuments. In polar regions, later covered by ice, they would not. Yet the knowledge itself could survive migration. People moving away from a polar homeland would carry with them an ingrained sensitivity to cycles. They might continue marking solstices even in environments where doing so was less critical. Over time, these practices could become ritualized rather than practical. This may help explain why so many ancient cultures placed enormous importance on solstices and equinoxes, even in regions where seasonal changes were mild. The ritual may have outlasted the environment that originally demanded it. The southern sky also lacks a single bright pole star equivalent to Polaris in the north, at least in the distant past. This absence forces navigators to rely on patterns rather than points. Instead of fixing direction on a star, they track arcs, rotations, and relative positions. Navigation under such a sky trains the mind differently. Orientation becomes relational rather than absolute. You know where you are based on movement, not fixed markers. This skill would be invaluable for migration across changing landscapes. If early populations migrated northward from southern latitudes, they would encounter skies that behaved differently. Stars would begin to rise and set. The sun's extremes would soften. Direction might become easier to fix, but something would be lost. The sky would feel less intimate, less enclosing. That contrast could imprint itself culturally. The old sky becomes sacred. The new sky becomes practical. Stories emerge to explain the difference. The heavens once moved differently. The world was once ordered another way. Many ancient cosmologies include the idea of a world axis, a central point around which the sky turns. In northern traditions, this is often associated with the pole star or a cosmic pillar. In southern traditions, it is less fixed, more dynamic. If a culture originated under a sky without a dominant pole star, their idea of cosmic order would emphasize motion rather than stasis. The universe would be seen as something that turns, not something anchored. This perspective fits intriguingly with some ancient symbols: wheels, spirals, circles divided into segments. These appear worldwide, but their meaning varies. In some contexts, they represent time. In others, the sky itself. It is tempting to interpret such symbols universally, but caution is needed. Similar forms can arise independently. Still, when combined with environmental context, they gain specificity. Astronomy also intersects with myth. Stories about gods traveling across the sky often mirror observable patterns. A god who disappears for months and then returns fits the behavior of the sun near the poles. A deity who circles endlessly without setting mirrors circumpole stars. These myths are not metaphors invented in isolation. They are explanations for lived experience. If that experience changes due to migration, the myth adapts, but its core remains. As people move away from polar regions, stories about long nights and endless days would become exaggerated, mysterious, or sacred. Listeners who never experienced such extremes would interpret them symbolically rather than literally. This process does not require deception. It happens naturally as memory detaches from environment. Another important aspect of polar astronomy is the prominence of the moon. In long nights, moonlight becomes a significant source of illumination. Lunar cycles would be closely observed. Tides, if coastal, would reinforce this attention. Lunar calendars appear early in human history. They're intuitive, visible, and reliable. In polar regions, where solar cues are extreme, lunar cycles offer a steadier rhythm. This could elevate the moon's importance culturally. Many ancient societies personified the moon as a keeper of time, fertility, or memory. These associations may reflect environments where lunar light played a critical role in survival. The southern sky also offers different seasonal star visibility. Constellations associated with animals or tools might align with hunting seasons or migrations. Over time, these alignments would become embedded in story. When such knowledge travels, it often detaches from its original ecological anchor. A constellation once signaling a specific animal's return might later signal a festival instead. The function shifts, but the pattern persists. Modern astronomy separates observation from meaning. Ancient astronomy could not afford to. Meaning was the point. The sky mattered because it told you when to act. If Antarctica ever hosted human observers, their astronomical knowledge would be deeply practical, deeply embodied, and deeply seasonal. It would not be written down. It would be lived. As ice advanced and populations moved, the sky would change. Familiar stars would sink lower. Others would rise. The sense of cosmic order would shift. Such changes could be interpreted as the world itself changing, not just perspective. This could feed into myths of ages ending and beginning. The heavens no longer behave as they once did. Something fundamental has shifted. From a scientific standpoint, this is simply latitude change. From a human standpoint, it is existential. The idea that astronomy could preserve memory of a southern origin does not require advanced science. It requires only that people notice patterns and cared enough to remember them. Some researchers have pointed out that certain ancient alignments make more sense at higher latitudes than where they are found today. This is debated and often speculative, but it highlights an important principle. Knowledge can move even when its optimal environment does not. A ritual aligned to a solstice might persist even after migration makes that solstice less dramatic. The ritual becomes tradition rather than necessity. In this way, astronomy becomes a carrier of memory. Not precise memory, but structural memory. The way time is divided, the way cycles are honored, the way the sky is described. Antarctica sealed beneath ice cannot show us stone observatories or star charts. But if its sky once shaped human understanding, that influence could be distributed far beyond its shores. The southern sky today still offers a glimpse of what such an environment teaches. It demands patience. It encourages long thinking. It resists haste. If astronomy shaped how people oriented themselves in the world, then it would also shape how they built, traveled, and remembered. The sky does not act alone. It interacts with land, water, and ice. And in places where those interactions were once balanced and later broken, memory lingers longest, not in stone, but in how people learn to look up and understand their place beneath a turning world. It is tempting to assume that civilization begins where conditions are easiest, where climates are gentle, rivers are predictable, and survival does not demand constant vigilance. This assumption feels reasonable because many of the civilizations we know best fit that description. Yet ease does not always produce complexity, and comfort does not automatically lead to innovation. Sometimes it is pressure, constraint, and the need to coordinate over long time scales that push human societies toward deeper organization. When viewed from that angle, the idea that civilization might have begun in a place like ancient Antarctica becomes less counterintuitive and more challenging in a productive way. Civilization is often described as a collection of visible achievements. Permanent settlements, agriculture, architecture, writing. But these are outcomes, not causes. They appear after a long period of social structuring, shared knowledge, and coordinated behavior. Before stone cities and fields of grain, There must be systems of trust, memory, planning, and transmission. These systems do not arise spontaneously. They emerge where survival depends on cooperation and foresight. A southern polar environment during a warmer phase would demand exactly those traits. Even without extreme cold, high latitudes impose constraints unfamiliar to equatorial regions. Seasonal variation is stronger. Light cycles are more dramatic. Resource availability fluctuates sharply over the year. In such an environment, individuals cannot rely solely on opportunistic behavior. They must plan, store, share, and synchronize. This synchronization is a key ingredient. When a community must agree on when to move, when to harvest, when to conserve, and when to prepare for scarcity, social coordination becomes essential. Timekeeping becomes collective rather than personal. Knowledge becomes communal rather than individual. In environments where food is available year-round, small groups can survive with relatively loose organization. In environments with long off-seasons, survival favors structure. People who fail to align their behavior with seasonal cycles are removed quickly from the population, either by migration or by death. Over generations, this creates cultures that value continuity, record-keeping, and adherence to shared rhythms. Ancient Antarctica, if it supported human populations during a milder epoch, would still impose strong seasonal demands. Long summers might offer abundance. Long winters would demand preparation. The balance between these phases would not forgive error. This kind of pressure encourages early forms of what we later call civilization, not in the form of cities, but in the form of rules, roles, and shared systems of meaning. Someone must remember when the light returns. Someone must pass that knowledge on. Someone must ensure that stores are protected and distributed fairly. These are social technologies. Another overlooked factor is isolation. Antarctica, even when warmer, would not be endlessly connected to surrounding lands. Its position would naturally limit casual movement. Populations living there would interact intensely with one another over long periods. This fosters strong cultural cohesion. Anthropologists have long noted that isolation can accelerate cultural complexity. When groups are small and stable, traditions accumulate, skills are refined, innovations are preserved rather than diluted. In contrast, highly mobile or constantly interacting populations may exchange ideas rapidly, but they may also lose depth. If early humans or prehuman groups spent extended time in a southern homeland, their culture could become unusually cohesive. Shared myths, shared calendars, shared expectations. Over time, this cohesion could crystallize into something recognizable as a civilizational core. It is also worth considering the role of observation. High-latitude environments reward careful attention to subtle cues. Small changes in the sun's position, star patterns, wind direction, or animal behavior can signal major shifts weeks or months ahead. People who notice these patterns survive. People who ignore them do not. This produces cultures that value observation and interpretation. The world becomes something to be read rather than simply used. The sky, the land, and the water form a single system that must be understood holistically. Such thinking aligns with the roots of science long before formal methods, pattern recognition, hypothesis testing, intergenerational verification. These are not inventions of modernity. They are survival strategies that become intellectual traditions. In this sense, a southern origin does not require imagining advanced technology or lost machines. It requires imagining people who paid very close attention to their environment and built social systems around that attention. Agriculture, often cited as the foundation of civilization, may not have been the first driver in such a place. Foraging, fishing, and seasonal harvesting could sustain populations without large-scale farming. What matters more is predictability and storage. If resources appear reliably but briefly, preserving them becomes essential. Food storage leads naturally to property concepts. Who owns what is stored? Who guards it? Who decides distribution? These questions force the development of norms and authority structures. Civilization begins not when people grow crops, but when they decide how to manage surplus. In polar or near-polar regions, surplus is not constant. It is episodic. This makes management more complex than in environments where food is continuously available. Complexity breeds structure. There is also the matter of social memory. In environments where mistakes are costly, societies develop mechanisms to remember past failures. Stories of famine, cold years, or migration become cautionary tales. Elders gain authority as repositories of experience. Tradition becomes a survival tool. This emphasis on memory aligns closely with the idea of a forgotten homeland, a place where remembering mattered deeply, even if later generations forgot why certain rules existed. Another factor often neglected in discussions of early civilization is health. Cold, adapted environments, even mild ones, limit the spread of certain pathogens. Seasonal cold reduces parasite loads. Populations may experience fewer endemic diseases than those in warm, humid regions. This does not mean life was easy. It means that long-term stability might be possible without constant disease pressure. Stability allows culture to accumulate. High mortality disrupts continuity. Lower disease burden supports long-lived individuals who can pass knowledge across generations. Coastal environments, which Antarctica would have had during warmer periods, add another layer. Coasts are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They offer fish, marine mammals, birds, and plant resources. Coastal foraging supports dense populations without agriculture. Combined with high latitude seasonality, this creates a powerful mix. Abundance during certain periods, scarcity during others, rich resources that require coordination to exploit efficiently, predictable cycles that reward planning. These are conditions under which social complexity thrives. One might object that such a civilization would leave clear evidence, but that expectation assumes durability of material culture. In an environment where wood, bone, and fiber dominate, and where later glaciation destroys surface layers, material traces would be minimal. Civilization does not require stone. Stone survives. That is not the same thing. The civilizations we know best are biased towards stone because stone endures. Cultures built on organic materials, even complex ones, leave far fainter archaeological signatures. When later environments actively erase those signatures, the result is silence. Silence, however, does not imply absence. It implies loss. Another point worth considering is timing. Human evolution did not unfold in a single location. It was distributed across multiple regions over long periods. Earlier hominins experimented with different ecological niches. Some succeeded briefly and vanished. Others contributed traits that persisted. A southern locus of early cultural complexity does not have to coincide with modern humans. It could involve ancestral populations whose innovations were inherited indirectly. Knowledge can outlive the people who originated it. Fire use, tool traditions, social structures. These can be passed between groups through contact, migration, or assimilation. Over time, origins blur. If Antarctica once hosted a stable, observant, coordinated population, its influence could radiate outward as climate changed. As conditions deteriorated, people would leave, carrying with them social technologies refined under pressure. Those technologies could then seed developments elsewhere, not as a single migration event, but as a long dispersal of practices. By the time written history begins, the source would be unrecognizable. This model contrasts sharply with the idea of civilization springing up independently in multiple river valleys. It does not replace that idea. It reframes it. Those river valleys may have been where civilization became visible, not where it became possible. Visibility depends on preservation. Possibility depends on conditions that favor social complexity. Another overlooked aspect is worldview. High-latitude environments foster a strong sense of collective fate. When winter threatens everyone equally, individualism becomes dangerous. Cooperation is not optional. Such environments reward fairness, coordination, and shared responsibility. These values underpin stable societies. They also underpin later legal and ethical systems. It is not difficult to imagine that populations shaped by such conditions would carry those values with them, even when moving into more forgiving environments. Over time, the original pressure fades, but the cultural imprint remains. This may help explain why some early civilizations place strong emphasis on law, order, and cosmic balance. Even when their environments did not strictly require it, the values may have been inherited rather than invented. One must also consider scale. Civilization does not appear full-grown. It scales up. Small groups coordinate, larger groups formalize, leadership roles emerge, rituals stabilize behavior. A southern origin does not imply massive populations. It implies early refinement of social coordination that later allowed scaling elsewhere. As climate shifted and Antarctica froze, that refinement would not vanish. It would travel. Eventually, the land itself would become inaccessible. Memory would fade. Direction would reverse. What was once central would become peripheral. At that point, civilization would appear to begin elsewhere because that is where it becomes visible and stable. But beginnings and appearances are not the same. None of this proves that civilization began in Antarctica. It explains why the idea is not absurd. It outlines conditions under which such a beginning would make sense, even if evidence is scarce. Civilization is not born from comfort alone. It is born from constraint met with cooperation, from environments that force people to think beyond the present moment, from places where survival depends on shared understanding rather than individual strength. A warmer Antarctica could have been such a place. The question will shift again from possibility to consequence. If a southern origin influenced early human development, how might that influence show up later? Scattered across the globe in unexpected ways. Cold does not arrive with ceremony. It creeps. It advances quietly year by year, generation by generation, altering patterns long before it announces itself as crisis. Rivers thin slightly earlier each season. Snow lingers where it once melted. Animals shift their routes. Plants struggle to return. For people living close to the land, these changes are impossible to ignore, yet difficult to interpret all at once. The Great Freeze, if it came to Antarctica while humans or their ancestors still occupied parts of it, would not have felt like an ending. It would have felt like a long, uneasy transition. Climate rarely forces instant abandonment. Instead, it creates a narrowing of options. What once worked becomes unreliable. What once felt predictable becomes risky. In such circumstances, movement is not a dramatic choice, but a gradual adjustment. Families relocate seasonally. Groups travel farther to find resources. Camps are used less frequently. Eventually, some places are no longer visited at all. This is how large migrations begin. Not with mass departures, but with small decisions repeated over time. As Antarctica cooled, the most immediate pressure would not necessarily have been temperature alone. Cooling reshapes ecosystems in complex ways. Growing seasons shorten. Vegetation changes composition. Animals that depend on certain plants move or decline. Coastal productivity shifts as sea ice alters marine food chains. For a society dependent on seasonal abundance, these changes would accumulate into stress. The familiar rhythm of the year would begin to slip. Storage strategies that once sufficed would fail more often. Planning horizons would shrink, replaced by improvisation. At first, adaptation would dominate. Humans are remarkably flexible. Clothing improves. Shelter becomes more insulated. Diets shift. These responses can buffer change for a long time, but flexibility has limits, especially when change is unidirectional. The key issue with polar cooling is that it does not oscillate evenly. Once certain thresholds are crossed, recovery becomes unlikely. Ice reflects sunlight. Reflected sunlight reduces warming. Each winter leaves more ice behind. The system reinforces itself. People living through this would not know the cause. They would only know the outcome. Winters growing longer, summers growing weaker, the sun behaving differently. The sky itself might feel altered as atmospheric conditions change. At some point, the cost of staying outweighs the cost of leaving. But leaving is not trivial. Movement requires routes, knowledge, and destinations. You do not abandon a homeland without some sense of where you're going. This is where geography matters. Antarctica's position makes southward movement meaningless. East and west eventually loop back. Only north offers escape from worsening conditions. North becomes not a direction of exploration, but of survival. This directional pressure would shape migration over immense time scales. Not one exodus, but many. Not a single people, but layers of movement. Some groups would leave earlier. Others would hold on longer, perhaps retreating inland or clinging to diminishing coastal refuge. As conditions worsened, social structures would strain. Scarcity amplifies conflict. Cooperation becomes both more necessary and more fragile. Groups may split. Traditions may fracture. Some knowledge may be lost as elders die without passing it on. Yet migration also selects. Groups that manage to move successfully carry forward the cultural traits that enabled them to survive the transition. Planning, coordination, memory. These traits do not disappear when the environment improves. They persist over generations. Northward movement would become normalized. Children would grow up hearing stories of places farther south that were no longer visited. These places would feel increasingly distant, almost imaginary. The idea of return would fade. Importantly, migration would not occur across a static world. As Antarctica froze, other regions changed too. Lower sea levels exposed new land bridges. Coastlines extended. Routes opened that later vanished. The geography of migration would be temporary, available only during certain climatic windows. This means that paths taken northward may no longer exist today. Corridors once used may now lie underwater or beneath ice. Archaeological traces along those paths would be sparse or destroyed. From the perspective of later populations, it would appear as if people simply appeared in new regions without clear origin. The trail behind them would be broken. As migrants moved into lower latitudes, they would encounter environments that felt strange in new ways. Less extreme seasonality, different skis, new animals and plants. Survival would still be challenging, but the nature of the challenge would shift. Cultural adaptations developed under polar pressures might feel excessive or unnecessary in these new settings. Strict seasonal planning might soften. Storage practices might change. Rituals tied to long nights or endless days might lose immediate relevance. Yet such practices rarely vanish overnight. They linger, transformed into tradition. What was once practical becomes symbolic. What was once survival becomes identity. This is how a long exodus leaves traces without leaving maps. The scale of time involved matters enormously. We tend to imagine migration as something that happens within a few lifetimes. In deep history, migration unfolds over thousands of years. No one experiences the entire journey. Each generation inherits only a small segment of the story. This fragmentation explains why origin myths are often vague. No one remembers the beginning because no one lived at both ends. Memory is pieced together from fragments shaped by the needs of the present. The Great Freeze would also affect perception of the past. As the southern homeland became increasingly hostile, stories about it might shift tone. What was once remembered fondly could become dangerous, forbidden, or cursed. This reframing helps justify separation. It reduces longing. Such psychological adaptation is common in displaced populations. When return is impossible, memory adjusts to protect the present. Over long periods, this process could invert meaning. The South might become associated with cold, darkness, or death. The North with life, renewal, or promise. Directional symbolism would realign with lived reality. Maps created much later would reinforce this inversion. North would be placed at the top, South at the bottom. The world would be visually reordered to match experience rather than origin. The exodus north would not produce a single cultural lineage. Groups would diverge, adapt to new environments, and interact with other populations. Genetic and cultural blending would occur. Any southern influence would diffuse rather than dominate. This diffusion makes detection difficult. Instead of a clear marker, one finds recurring patterns. Emphasis on cycles, strong seasonal rituals, deep respect for elders, anxiety around climatic instability. Such traits appear in many early societies. They often attributed to local conditions, and rightly so. Yet they could also be inherited tendencies, reinforced by new environments rather than invented there. Another consequence of the Great Freeze would be the disruption of long-distance knowledge networks. If Antarctica once acted as a hub, its loss would fragment communication. Groups would become more regionally focused. Shared traditions would diverge. This fragmentation aligns with the archaeological record. Early human cultures show increasing regional diversity over time. Shared tool traditions break apart. Artistic styles localize. This is what one would expect after a central node disappears. It is also worth considering the emotional dimension of such a long departure. Humans are not purely rational movers. Attachment to place runs deep. Leaving a homeland is traumatic even when necessary. That trauma would imprint itself culturally. Stories of loss, exile, and wandering are common across traditions. They resonate because displacement is a universal human experience amplified during periods of environmental change. The Great Freeze is a slow catastrophe, would produce exactly this kind of emotional legacy. No single disaster to point to. No clear villain, just a world that no longer supports what it once did. Modern discussions of climate migration echo these themes. Communities today facing rising seas or desertification often resist leaving until options are exhausted. When they do move, the sense of loss persists long after resettlement. Project that experience across millennia, and you begin to see how deeply such an event could shape human consciousness. From a biological standpoint, migration under pressure also influences selection. Traits that favor cooperation, planning, and social cohesion become advantageous over time. These traits may become more prevalent. This does not imply genetic determinism of culture, but it does suggest feedback between environment, behavior, and survival. A long exodus selects for people who can manage change collectively. If those people then populate new regions, they carry that legacy with them. The environment changes again, but the cultural imprint remains. By the time agriculture, cities, and writing emerge elsewhere, the memory of the Great Freeze would be unrecognizable. It would survive only as mythic time, an age before the present, a time when the world was different. And yet that deep past would still exert influence in how people think about stability, in their fear of climate unpredictability, in their reverence for cycles and seasons. The idea that civilization might carry within it a memory of environmental exile is not far-fetched. Many of our strongest cultural themes revolve around loss, return, and renewal. These themes do not arise in static worlds. As Antarctica became fully sealed by ice, the exodus would complete itself. No one would remain who remembered the land directly. Knowledge of roots would vanish. The homeland would slip entirely into abstraction. At that point, Antarctica would cease to exist in human geography. It would persist only as an idea, if at all. This disappearance sets the stage for later rediscovery. When humans eventually encounter Antarctica again, they approach it as explorers, not descendants. The land feels alien because the connection has been severed. That severance is what makes the question compelling. How can something so vast vanish so completely from memory? The answer lies not in sudden erasure, but in slow departure. The Great Freeze did not end a civilization in a single moment. It dissolved a way of life gradually, scattering its people and their practices across the globe. By the time history begins to write itself, the source is already gone. What remains are patterns, questions, and a faint sense that humanity did not always live where it does now. Across continents that never touched in recorded history, certain shapes keep reappearing. Carved into stone, etched into pottery, painted on cave walls, or arranged in monumental alignments, they appear quietly persistent circles divided into segments, spirals expanding outward, crosses oriented to the cardinal directions, serpentine lines that twist without clear beginning or end. These symbols emerge in places separated by oceans, climates, and thousands of years. Yet they feel oddly familiar, as if they belong to a shared visual language whose grammar was learned long before words were written down. Archaeology often treats symbols cautiously, and for good reason. Humans are capable of inventing similar shapes independently. A circle is simple. A spiral appears in nature. A cross can emerge from basic geometry. Similarity alone does not prove connection. Yet when patterns repeat not just in form but in context, orientation, and usage, coincidence becomes harder to assume automatically. The question then is not whether ancient cultures copied symbols from one another directly, but whether they inherited ways of thinking shaped by similar deep experiences. Shared pressures can produce shared expressions. And if humanity once passed through a common environmental bottleneck, even a very ancient one, the cultural echoes of that passage could persist long after the original context vanished. Stone, unlike ice or wood, remembers. It preserves intention long after meaning fades. A carving remains even when the story explaining it is forgotten. This makes stone one of the few reliable witnesses to humanity's deep past, even if it speaks in fragments rather than sentences. One of the most widespread symbolic forms is the circle. Circles appear in Neolithic monuments, Bronze Age carvings, indigenous rock art, and early urban designs. Sometimes they represent the sun or moon. Sometimes they mark sacred space. Sometimes they function as calendars or gathering points. The circle's meaning shifts, but its presence endures. In high-latitude environments, circles take on particular importance. The sun does not rise and set cleanly. It moves in arcs, looping around the horizon. Time itself feels circular rather than linear. A worldview shaped under such skis would naturally gravitate towards circular representations of time, life, and order. Spirals add another layer. Unlike closed circles, spirals imply movement, return without repetition, change within continuity. They appear carved into stones in places as distant as Ireland, Malta, the American Southwest, and New Zealand. In some cultures, spirals are associated with life force, breath, or journey. In others, with water or the path of the sun. Spirals are particularly evocative in the context of migration. They suggest outward movement from a center followed by return in altered form. This aligns uncannily with the idea of long dispersal from a central homeland, not as a straight line, but as a spreading influence that never fully loses its point of origin. Another recurring motif is the cross or quartered circle. Often misunderstood as a purely religious symbol in later contexts, its older usage is frequently astronomical or directional. The cross divides space into four seasons, 4 directions, 4 phases. This structure appears in ancient sites where orientation mattered deeply. Stone circles and megalithic sites often align with solstices and equinoxes. Their builders clearly tracked celestial cycles. What is striking is how similar these alignments are across vast distances. Different cultures using different materials oriented structures toward the same solar events. This suggests not a single blueprint, but a shared priority. Time mattered, cycles mattered, orientation mattered. These priorities do not arise randomly. They arise where survival depends on long-term coordination with environmental rhythms. In regions with mild climates, missing a seasonal marker might mean inconvenience. In harsher environments, it can mean catastrophe. A culture forged under such conditions would carry an ingrained respect for timing and alignment. The use of stone itself is revealing. Stone is difficult to work. Choosing it implies an intention to preserve something beyond immediate use. Stone structures often mark places rather than functions. They say this matters. They endure because the meaning they encode is expected to endure. If early populations carried certain symbolic frameworks with them as they migrated, stone would become a natural medium to anchor those frameworks in new landscapes. Even if the original environmental pressure was gone, the impulse to mark cycles and directions would remain. This may explain why some early monumental structures appear in places that did not strictly require them. The effort invested seems disproportionate to immediate survival needs. Yet if the practice was inherited, its repetition would feel necessary even if its original function had softened. Consider the repeated emphasis on world centers in ancient cultures. Axis mundi concepts appear globally. A mountain, tree, pillar, or stone marks the center of the world connecting sky, land, and underworld. This center is not always geographically central. It is symbolically central. If a true geographic center once existed in human memory and was later lost, cultures might recreate that center symbolically wherever they settled. The act of marking a center becomes more important than locating the original one. This symbolic reproduction is a known phenomenon. Displaced populations often recreate sacred layouts from their homeland in new locations. Temples are built facing the same direction. Rituals are performed at the same times. Continuity is maintained through form rather than place over long time scales. The original reason for these practices fades. What remains is tradition. Stone carvings of animals also show intriguing parallels. Certain animals appear repeatedly in early art, sometimes in exaggerated or abstracted forms. Serpents, birds, large mammals. These creatures are often associated with transition, movement, or the boundary between worlds. In polar or near-polar environments, animals are critical indicators of seasonal change. Their migrations signal shifts in climate. Their behavior becomes a calendar. Elevating such animals to symbolic status is a practical response that later becomes mythological. As people migrate into new environments, the same symbolic animals may no longer be present. The symbol persists even when the animal does not. A serpent may remain meaningful even where snakes are rare. A bird may retain cosmic significance even if it no longer migrates the same way. This persistence suggests that the symbol's meaning was abstracted early. It was not tied solely to local ecology, but to a deeper framework of understanding. Another recurring feature is the use of stone to mark transitions, burial sites, thresholds, places where movement changes direction, passes, shorelines, crossroads. Stone is placed where change occurs. If a population experienced a profound transition, such as leaving a homeland permanently, the act of marking transition would take on special importance. Stone becomes a way to say something changed here. These markers could proliferate as people move, leaving a trail of symbolic echoes rather than physical maps. Later observers would see only isolated monuments, not realizing they are fragments of a much older pattern. Modern archaeology often interprets symbols within regional contexts, and rightly so. Meaning is always local. Yet local meanings do not arise in isolation. They're shaped by inherited frameworks. When similar frameworks appear repeatedly, the possibility of shared deep ancestry arises, not genetically but culturally. Culture can be older than populations. Ideas outlive people. A practice learned in one place can persist through many migrations, adapting to new environments while retaining its core logic. If Antarctica ever functioned as a long-term human habitat during a warmer phase, it would have shaped culture under conditions unlike those of later centers. Strong seasonality, dramatic light cycles, isolation. These conditions would favor certain symbolic priorities. Those priorities, once established, would not vanish when people left. They would travel quietly, influencing how new society structured space, time, and meaning. This does not imply a single lost civilization exporting symbols wholesale. It implies a shared ancestral experience that shaped cognition itself. How humans conceptualized cycles, how they oriented themselves, how they marked importance. Stone becomes the medium through which those conceptual habits are made visible. Not because stone was chosen deliberately to transmit a message across millennia, but because stone survives long enough for us to notice. The difficulty lies in interpretation. Symbols are ambiguous. A circle can mean many things. A spiral can be decorative. Archaeologists must avoid overreach. Yet avoidance can also limit inquiry. When similarities are repeatedly dismissed without deeper examination, patterns remain unexplored. The more productive approach is comparative, not to claim certainty, but to ask why certain forms cluster around certain concerns, why cycles, directions, and centers matter so deeply across early cultures. Environmental pressure offers one answer. Shared origin offers another. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. A shared origin could amplify the effects of later environments, reinforcing certain tendencies. It is also possible that Antarctica's role, if any, was not as a direct source of symbols, but as a formative environment that shaped early human cognition. If early populations spent long periods adapting to polar conditions, those adaptations could influence how their descendants thought even after leaving. Cognition is shaped by environment. Spatial awareness, time perception, and risk assessment all respond to lived conditions. These traits influence culture at every level. Seen this way, shared symbols are not messages from a lost place. They are fingerprints of a shared way of thinking. This reframing removes the need for speculative claims about advanced lost civilizations. It grounds the discussion in known human capacities: observation, memory, transmission, adaptation. The echoes in stone do not point to a single answer. They point to continuity. They suggest that humanity's deep past involved experiences profound enough to leave lasting impressions, even as landscapes changed beyond recognition. As ice erased physical traces in some regions, stone preserved abstract ones elsewhere. The imbalance of preservation creates illusion. It makes some places appear foundational simply because their markers survived. Antarctica, sealed and silent, offers no stone circles to examine. But the absence of monuments there does not negate the possibility that its influence was exported rather than preserved in place. In that sense, the most important traces of a lost southern past would not be found beneath ice. They would be scattered across the world, embedded in the way ancient people thought about time, space, and order. Following those traces requires patience and humility. It requires accepting that some questions cannot be answered definitively. It requires resisting the urge to force coherence where ambiguity remains. Yet ambiguity does not equal meaninglessness. Patterns can exist without clear narratives. Echoes can persist without identifiable sources. Stone remembers what ice forgets. And sometimes what stone remembers is not a place, but a way of being in the world that once made sense beneath very different skis. Forgetting is not a failure of history. It is one of its default conditions. What survives into the present does so not because it mattered most, but because circumstances allowed it to persist. History, as we inherit it, is a filtered residue shaped by climate, materials, power, and chance. When a place disappears from the lived world early enough and thoroughly enough, it does not leave a gap. It leaves nothing at all. Antarctica, more than almost any other region on Earth, fits the conditions required to be forgotten first. To understand why, it helps to separate two ideas that are often treated as the same. One is importance, the other is visibility. A place can be profoundly important to human history, and yet leave almost no visible trace. Visibility depends on preservation. Preservation depends on environment. Antarctica's environment is uniquely hostile to memory. Most of what we know about early human history comes from places where materials endure. Stone tools survive. Bone survives in dry caves. Settlements leave layers of debris that accumulate rather than vanish. These conditions exist unevenly across the planet. Large portions of the world were never archaeologically generous. Forests erase. Wetlands dissolve. Ice annihilates. Antarctica combines all three destructive forces. Organic material decays rapidly during warm periods. When cooling begins, ice grinds rather than gently buries. When ice retreats and advances repeatedly, whatever remains is reworked again and again. This is not concealment. It is obliteration. If human presence in Antarctica ever existed, it would have faced the worst possible preservation lottery. Early societies rarely built in stone, unless the material was abundant and necessary. In a landscape once rich in wood, bone, and plant fiber, those would be the preferred materials. None of them survive glaciation. Even fire, one of humanity's most durable signatures, leaves subtle traces that can be erased by ice movement. Charcoal layers are fragile. Ash disperses. Soil horizons are scraped away. What archaeology depends on is stability, not just age. Contrast this with regions that later became civilizational centers. The Middle East, parts of Africa, South Asia. These areas experienced long periods without total surface erasure. Even when climates changed, they changed without sealing the land beneath kiln of moving ice. Human traces accumulated rather than being reset to zero. History does not remember beginnings evenly. It remembers what stayed exposed. Another factor working against Antarctica is timing. If its role, hypothetical or real, occurred early enough before writing, before large-scale monument building, before durable architecture, then it would already be disadvantaged in the historical record. Add glaciation on top of that, and disappearance becomes almost guaranteed. Written history is astonishingly recent. It covers a tiny fraction of human existence. Anything that happened before writing must be reconstructed indirectly through fragments and inference. When fragments are erased, inference becomes speculation. Antarctica's freezing predates writing by tens of millions of years. If human involvement occurred near the tail end of its habitable phases or during transitional periods, that involvement would sit far beyond the reach of texts. No chronicles, no inscriptions, no names. Once writing emerges elsewhere, it anchors history geographically. Places with writing become centers. Places without it recede. Later, historians inherit those anchors and mistake them for origins. This is not deception. It is inertia. Another reason Antarctica would be forgotten first lies in how humans prioritize space. Memory follows utility. We remember places we can return to. We forget places that no longer matter to survival. When a region becomes permanently inaccessible, it ceases to generate new experiences. No births there, no deaths, no trade, no conflict. Memory requires renewal. Without reinforcement, even significant places fade. Consider drowned coastlines after the last ice age. Some are remembered through oral tradition for thousands of years. But eventually, even those memories thin. Antarctica's loss would be far more severe. Not submerged beneath visible water, but sealed beneath ice. Unreachable, unrecognizable. Return shapes remembrance. Antarctica offers none. The great migrations away from a freezing southern land would reinforce this process. As generations move north, their immediate concerns reorient. Children grow up in new landscapes. Elders die far from the place they once knew. Stories lose geographic precision. Eventually, the old homeland becomes a story without coordinates, then a symbol, then a metaphor, then silence. Silence is not noticed when it arrives gradually. There is also a cognitive bias at work. Humans construct histories that feel coherent. We prefer narratives where origins align with visible development. We like civilization to begin where cities appear, where writing begins, where monuments rise. A place that leaves no monuments disrupts that preference. Rather than reworking the narrative to include an invisible origin, we exclude the origin altogether. This bias shapes academic inquiry as much as popular imagination. Research follows evidence. Evidence follows preservation. Preservation follows environment. Antarctica sits at the end of that chain. The absence becomes self-reinforcing. Because Antarctica appears empty, few ask whether it was always so. Because few ask, fewer look. Because fewer look, absence remains. This does not imply neglect or conspiracy. It is simply how knowledge systems behave under uncertainty. Power dynamics also matter. History is written by societies that endure long enough to record themselves. Those societies tend to emerge in stable, resource-rich environments. Antarctica, even in a milder state, would not support large expanding populations indefinitely. Its role, if any, would be formative, rather than dominant. Formative regions often disappear from view. They shape what comes after without being visible themselves. Think of early childhood shaping adult behavior. The child does not appear in the biography, but its influence is everywhere. History favors adults. Maps reinforce this forgetting. Once Antarctica froze completely, it dropped out of practical navigation. Medieval and early modern maps treated the southern continent as theoretical. Terra Australis became an idea rather than a destination. When Europeans finally reached Antarctica, they did so without cultural continuity. There were no living descendants to say this is where we came from. The land was encountered as new, not returned to. Rediscovery replaces memory. This is a crucial point. History does not distinguish between first contact and last contact. When a place vanishes from human experience long enough, encountering it again feels like discovery, even if it once mattered deeply. Antarctica's rediscovery in the modern era cemented its status as a historical. It entered global awareness as a scientific object, not a cultural one. Ice cores, penguins, weather stations, no ancestral claims, no ruins, no contested histories. That framing persists. Contrast this with regions like the Americas, where indigenous histories persisted despite colonization. Even when written records were suppressed, living cultures maintained memory. Antarctica has no such continuity. History depends on people to remember it. Another reason Antarctica would be forgotten first lies in how migration narratives are structured. Human history is often told as a story of expansion into new frontiers. Africa outward, fertile lands tamed, wilderness conquered. A retreat narrative does not fit comfortably into this model. Leaving a homeland due to environmental decline challenges the idea of progress. It suggests vulnerability rather than mastery. Such narratives are less likely to be preserved unless they serve a moral purpose. Flood myths survive because they teach lessons. Long, slow freezes are harder to mythologize. They lack drama. They lack villains. They dissolve rather than explode. Over time, societies reshape their stories to emphasize agency. We moved because we wanted to. We explored. We discovered. We built. We rarely say we left because the world stopped supporting us. This psychological reframing pushes abandoned places further into obscurity. Antarctica's disappearance would be the ultimate example of this. No dramatic destruction, no single catastrophe, just gradual loss. Gradual loss is the easiest kind to forget. There is also the issue of scale. Antarctica is enormous. Paradoxically, that makes it easier to ignore. Large featureless spaces do not invite storytelling. Humans attach meaning to places through landmarks, mountains, rivers, valleys. Once ice covers everything, those landmarks vanish from experience. The land becomes abstract, hard to personalize, hard to narrate. Smaller lost places are easier to remember. A drowned island, a buried city. Antarctica is too big to mourn in detail, so it becomes background. Finally, there is the problem of proof. History prefers what can be demonstrated. When evidence is lacking, silence is safer than speculation. Over time, silence hardens into assumption. Antarctica becomes a place where nothing happened because nothing can be shown to have happened. Yet this logic is circular. Nothing is shown because the environment erases. The environment erases because of ice. Ice arrived early. Therefore, Antarctica exits the historical stage before the play is written down. Being forgotten first does not mean being unimportant. It means being early, unstable, and erased. If Antarctica played any role in humanity's deep past, it would be precisely the kind of role history struggles to remember. Foundational rather than visible, transitional rather than triumphant, environmental rather than political. These are the layers history sheds first. Understanding this does not require accepting any single hypothesis about lost civilizations or southern origins. It requires recognizing how uneven our access to the past really is. History is not a complete record. It is a survivor's tale. The places that remain in it are the places that stayed accessible, inhabited, and narratable. The places that vanished early under ice or water or jungle become footnotes at best, myths at worst, and nothing at all most of the time. Antarctica, sealed and silent, fits every criterion for erasure. And yet, erasure does not mean irrelevance. It means that if traces exist, they must be sought indirectly in patterns, in migrations, in shared structures of thought. The fact that Antarctica is absent from early history may tell us less about what happened there and more about how history itself is constructed. Sometimes the first place to be forgotten is the place that shaped everything that followed precisely, because it disappeared before anyone learned how to write it down. In recent decades, science has begun circling back toward questions it once dismissed as unanswerable. Not because curiosity suddenly appeared, but because tools finally caught up with imagination. Antarctica, long treated as a frozen boundary rather than a historical participant, has slowly shifted from the margins of inquiry to the center of several unexpected scientific conversations. Not about lost civilizations directly, but about climate memory, planetary change, and the deep context in which human history unfolded. In doing so, modern science finds itself brushing against ideas that sound ancient, speculative, or even mythic, yet are grounded firmly in data. This return does not happen dramatically. There is no announcement that history must be rewritten. Instead, it happens quietly through incremental discoveries that complicate what once seemed settled. Ice cores drill deeper than ever before. Radar revealing landscapes no one knew existed. Climate models reconstructing worlds radically different from the present. Each finding on its own is technical and restrained. Together, they reopen questions that have been closed prematurely. One of the most significant shifts has been the recognition that Antarctica is not static. For much of the 20th century, it was treated as a constant, a frozen control variable in Earth's climate system. Ice was assumed to be ancient, stable, and largely unchanging on human time scales. That assumption has collapsed. Ice cores now show detailed climate oscillations, extending back hundreds of thousands of years. These records demonstrate that Antarctica responded dynamically to global climate shifts, sometimes warming significantly, sometimes cooling rapidly. The ice sheet expanded and contracted. Coastal regions opened and closed. The continent was not always sealed in the way we see today. This matters because it reframes Antarctica not as a timeless wasteland, but as a participant in planetary history, a place that changed, sometimes dramatically, during periods relevant to human evolution. At the same time, subglacial mapping has transformed our understanding of what lies beneath the ice. Radar and gravity measurements reveal mountain ranges, river valleys, basins, and plateaus. Antarctica is not a smooth slab of rock buried under ice. It is a continent with a complex eroded surface shaped by water and time. Some of these features resemble landscapes where humans elsewhere have lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Broad valleys, ancient river systems, coastal plains now submerged. These discoveries do not prove human presence, but they dismantle the assumption that Antarctica was always inherently unsuitable. Climate modeling adds another layer. By reconstructing past atmospheric conditions, scientists can simulate periods when Antarctica's climate was far milder than today. Warmer oceans, different wind patterns, higher carbon dioxide levels. Under such conditions, seasonal ice retreat along the coast becomes plausible. Ice-free corridors appear. Marine productivity increases. These models are not speculative fantasies. They're constrained by data from sediments, fossils, and isotopes. They describe worlds that actually existed, even if briefly in geological terms. Modern science is also grappling with the realization that human history itself is older and more complex than previously thought. Fossil discoveries continue to push back timelines. Tool use appears earlier. Migration happens faster and farther than expected. Human ancestors were not confined to narrow ecological niches. They experimented widely. This broader view of human adaptability weakens arguments that certain environments were categorically off-limits. Humans and prehumans survived ice ages, deserts, and high altitudes. They crossed open water. They followed coastlines into unfamiliar lands. Antarctica's exclusion from this narrative has rested less on evidence and more on assumption. The assumption that because it is uninhabitable now, it must always have been so. Science is increasingly uncomfortable with that kind of assumption. Another development reshaping the conversation is the study of ancient DNA and population genetics. Genetic data reveals complex patterns of divergence, bottlenecks, and migrations that do not always align neatly with known archaeological sites. Some population splits appear deeper than expected. Others suggest movements that leave no clear material trail. This does not point directly to Antarctica, but it reinforces a key idea. Human movement and interaction have been more intricate than surface evidence alone suggests. Some pathways may be invisible to archaeology is currently practiced. Science is also becoming more attentive to submerged landscapes. Advances in marine archaeology have revealed that vast areas of early human habitation now lie underwater. Continental shelves once supported dense populations. When sea levels rose, those worlds disappeared. This realization has forced a reevaluation of coastal migration theories. Humans likely spent much of their early history near coasts, following predictable food sources. These areas are now among the least accessible for study. Antarctica's coastal zones, buried under ice or submerged beneath shelves, fit squarely into this category of lost landscapes. Modern science recognizes that what we cannot easily access may still matter. Perhaps most importantly, there has been a philosophical shift within science itself. The boundary between hard and soft questions has become more permeable. Climate scientists talk openly about uncertainty. Archaeologists acknowledge preservation bias. Historians engage with deep time. This does not mean science is embracing speculation. It means it is becoming more honest about limits. As those limits are acknowledged, older questions resurface. Where did human social complexity begin? Why do certain cultural patterns appear globally? How much of human history is missing due to environmental eras? These are not new questions. They are ancient ones asked long before modern disciplines existed. What is new is the ability to approach them with data rather than myth alone. There's also growing interdisciplinary collaboration. Climate scientists work with archaeologists. Geneticists consult anthropologists. Geologists engage with historians. Antarctica, because of its extreme conditions, has long been a site of such collaboration. Ice core projects already involve multiple fields. This interdisciplinary culture makes it easier for unconventional questions to be raised without being dismissed outright. A climate scientist mapping ancient coastlines may naturally wonder who, if anyone, lived there. An archaeologist studying migration may notice gaps that align suspiciously well with glaciated regions. Science does not leap to conclusions, but it does notice patterns. Another subtle change lies in how science treats absence. Absence is no longer automatically interpreted as non-existence. Preservation bias is now a central concept. Researchers routinely ask not only what is present, but what conditions would have been required for presence to be preserved. Applied to Antarctica, this lens is sobering. Almost no conditions favor preservation of early human activity there. The fact that we find nothing tells us little. Technology continues to advance. Ground-penetrating radar grows more precise. Autonomous submersibles explore beneath ice shelves. Satellite data improves resolution year-by-year. While none of these tools are designed to search for ancient human traces, they increase baseline knowledge of the continent's structure. Each improvement reduces ignorance, even if it does not deliver answers. At the same time, ethical frameworks guide what science will and will not do. Antarctica is protected by international agreement. Large-scale excavation is neither feasible nor acceptable. This ensures that some questions will remain unanswered, at least directly. Science must therefore rely on indirect methods, modeling, comparison, inference. Indirect does not mean invalid. Astronomy inferred planets long before they were observed. Physics inferred particles before detectors existed. Science often advances by following what effects suggest about unseen causes. In this sense, returning to the question of Antarctica's role in human history is not unscientific. It is simply incomplete. There is also a cultural aspect to this return. As modern societies confront climate change, the idea of lost landscapes and displaced populations becomes less abstract. Rising seas, melting ice, and forced migration are no longer hypothetical. They are lived realities. This lived experience makes ancient climate-driven displacement easier to imagine. The idea that entire regions could become uninhabitable within human memory no longer feels far-fetched. Modern science does not operate in a vacuum. It is shaped by contemporary concerns. As those concerns shift, so do the questions scientists feel permitted to ask. The ancient question in this context is not, was there a civilization in Antarctica? That framing is too narrow and too burdened by expectation. The deeper question is how environmental change shapes where human history becomes visible. Science is increasingly willing to admit that visibility is not the same as importance. By studying Antarctica's climate history, scientists are learning how quickly worlds can transform, how coastlines vanish, how ecosystems collapse, how ice can erase landscapes within geologically short periods. These lessons apply everywhere, not just to the southern continent. The return to ancient questions is therefore not about validating old myths or speculative theories. It is about recognizing that the past may be more fragmented than we assumed, and that fragmentation follows patterns. Antarctica is an extreme case of those patterns. Early transformation, total erasure, complete disconnection. If science struggles to reconstruct what happened there, that struggle itself is informative. It reveals the blind spots in our methods and assumptions. There's also humility in this return. Science is learning to say, we do not know without closing the door. It distinguishes between lack of evidence and evidence of lack. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Modern science does not confirm that Antarctica was once central to human civilization. It does something more important. It removes the certainty that it never could have been. That shift, small as it may seem, changes the intellectual landscape. It allows new hypotheses to be formed carefully. It encourages cross-disciplinary dialogue. It invites deeper consideration of how history is constructed. As more data accumulates, the picture of Earth's past grows less tidy. Timelines stretch. Boundaries blur. Simple origin stories fracture into networks of movement and adaptation. Antarctica sits at the heart of this complexity, not as an answer, but as a reminder of how much remains unknown. Science returning to an ancient question does not mean abandoning rigor. It means applying rigor to questions that were once dismissed as unproductive. The most profound scientific advances often begin this way, not with answers, but with the realization that earlier certainty was misplaced. In that sense, Antarctica functions as both subject and symbol, a place that forces science to confront the limits of evidence, the power of environment, and the fragility of memory. What it would mean if the world we take for granted is only the latest version of many. What it would mean if human history began in places now erased. Science may never deliver a definitive verdict on Antarctica's role in early civilization, but by returning to the question with better tools and deeper humility, it reshapes how we think about origins altogether. Imagine for a moment that the place we now call Antarctica was not always a distant abstraction, but once felt familiar under human feet, not as ice and silence, but as land that could be read, anticipated, and depended upon. If that were true, even partially, then the question at the end of this long exploration is no longer geological or archaeological. It becomes personal, because if Antarctica was once home, then what we are today is not simply the product of progress, but of departure. Human identity is deeply tied to origin. We define ourselves by where we come from, even when that place exists only as a story. Nations, cultures, families, and individuals all build meaning around beginnings. When beginnings are clear and visible, identity feels grounded. When beginnings are obscured, identity becomes more fluid, more narrative-driven. If humanity's deep past includes a homeland that no longer exists in any recognizable form, then we are in a fundamental sense a species shaped by loss before we were shaped by settlement. That framing changes how we interpret much of human behavior. Throughout history, humans have been restless. We migrate even when we do not have to. We explore beyond necessity. We build stories about promised lands, returns, and futures just over the horizon. Even when we are materially secure, there is often a sense that something lies elsewhere, something not yet reached. This restlessness is often explained in economic, political, or biological terms. Competition, curiosity, survival. All of these are valid. Yet they may not be complete. A species whose formative experience included leaving a homeland due to environmental change would carry a different psychological inheritance. Movement would not just be opportunity. It would be familiarity. Stability would feel provisional. Change would feel inevitable. If Antarctica was once home, then humanity's relationship with place has been unsettled from the beginning. Consider how often human cultures imagine a lost age. A time before things went wrong. A world that was more balanced, more ordered, closer to something essential. These stories appear in religious traditions, philosophies, and secular narratives alike. They are not confined to any one geography. The persistence of this theme suggests it speaks to something universal in human experience. Not necessarily a specific event, but a pattern of displacement repeated often enough to become archetypal. A southern homeland lost to ice would represent the most extreme version of that pattern. A place not conquered, not destroyed by enemies, but simply rendered unlivable by the planet itself. No villain, no moral failure, just change. That kind of loss leaves a different imprint than war or collapse. It teaches that the world is not obliged to remain hospitable. That survival depends on adaptation, not entitlement. If that lesson sits at the foundation of human history, it may help explain why humans are both deeply inventive and deeply anxious. We build technologies to control our environment, yet we fear losing control. We settle, yet we plan escape routes. We create permanence, yet we tell stories about impermanence. Being descended from a people who had to leave everything behind would make adaptability central to identity. It would also complicate the idea of belonging. If the first home was lost and never reclaimed, then belonging becomes something you construct rather than inherit. Culture replaces landscape. Shared stories replace shared ground. This aligns with what we see anthropologically. Humans bond strongly to groups, symbols, and narratives. Territory matters, but meaning matters more. When territory is unstable, meaning becomes portable. Religion, art, ritual, and law all serve this function. They create continuity when geography cannot. If Antarctica was home, then humanity's earliest continuity may not have been spatial at all. It may have been temporal, a commitment to remembering, to transmitting knowledge across generations, even as surroundings changed. That commitment would make us a species unusually invested in memory. Not just individual memory, but collective memory. History, genealogy, myth, and record-keeping would all become survival tools long before they became academic interests. This could explain why humans are so obsessed with origins, even when those origins are inaccessible. We ask where we came from because knowing matters, even when it does not offer practical benefit. There's also a darker implication. A species shaped by environmental exile may carry a latent expectation of future loss. The idea that no place is permanent can breed caution, but it can also breed extraction. Use what you can while you can. Move on when necessary. This tension is visible throughout history. Humans care for their environments, and humans destroy them. Sometimes these behaviors coexist within the same culture. If the first great loss was imposed by climate rather than choice, later losses caused by human action might feel less shocking, even if they are more avoidable. The line between adaptation and exploitation blurs. Seen this way, modern environmental crises take on a deeper resonance. Rising seas, melting ice, shifting climates. These are not new challenges in principle. They are echoes of conditions humanity may have faced before. What is new is scale and speed. The changes unfolding now are driven largely by human activity, not orbital cycles or continental drift. That difference matters morally, but psychologically the experience may feel hauntingly familiar. Displacement, uncertainty, the sense that the ground beneath us is less reliable than we assumed. If Antarctica was once home, then we are not strangers to this feeling. We are returning to it under different circumstances. This perspective does not absolve responsibility. It sharpens it. A species that knows, even unconsciously, what it means to lose a world should be uniquely motivated to preserve the one it has. And yet, knowing does not always translate into action. Memory fades. Lessons soften. What once ensured survival becomes abstract. That may be another inheritance of a lost homeland. The danger of forgetting why certain values mattered in the first place. When environments become stable again, practices born of necessity can feel burdensome. Long-term planning feels excessive. Respect for cycles feels ritualistic rather than practical. Over time, those practices erode until conditions change again. If Antarctica was home, then humanity's story is not one of linear ascent from simplicity to complexity. It is a story of repeated adjustment to instability, of carrying forward tools shaped by one environment into another that does not obviously require them. This could explain why some aspects of civilization seem mismatched to their surroundings. Why monumental planning emerges in places where it is not strictly necessary. Why cosmic order matters even when survival does not depend on it directly. These may be inherited habits from a time when misreading the world carried existential risk. There is also the question of humility. Modern humans often see themselves as masters of their environment. Technology reinforces this illusion. We insulate ourselves from seasonal change. We transport food across continents. We light the night. Yet beneath this control lies fragility. Supply chains break. Climate destabilizes. Systems optimized for efficiency prove brittle under stress. If our species began with a lesson in environmental humility, that lesson may have been buried under success rather than erased. Antarctica in this sense becomes a mirror, a reminder that Earth does not revolve around human plans, that habitability is conditional, that stability is temporary. If Antarctica was home, then being human means being a long-term migrant, even when we forget that fact. It means carrying tools, stories, and expectations shaped by places that no longer exist. It also means that identity is less about where we are than about how we respond to change. This reframing can feel unsettling. Origins are comforting when they're clear and celebratory. They are harder to sit with when they involve loss and displacement. Yet there is also resilience here. A species that survived the loss of an entire homeland, if such a thing occurred, is capable of extraordinary adaptation. That capacity is evident in how widely humans spread, how many environments we learn to inhabit. The danger lies not in movement, but in denial. In forgetting that adaptation has limits. In assuming that every challenge can be solved without consequence. If Antarctica was home, then the ice covering it is not just frozen water. It is a record of what happens when conditions shift beyond what a place can support. It is a warning written on a continental scale. What does that make us now? It makes us descendants of change, not permanence. It makes us carriers of memory we barely recognize. It makes us participants in a story much longer than our written records suggest. It also places responsibility on the present. If we are the inheritors of a past shaped by environmental transformation, then how we respond to our own transformations matters deeply. History may never confirm whether Antarctica truly hosted humanity's earliest chapters. Evidence may remain buried or erased forever. But the exercise of asking the question reshapes perspective regardless of the answer. It encourages humility about what we know. It encourages caution about what we assume. It reminds us that the world we inhabit is one version among many. If Antarctica was home, then home is not a fixed location. It is a relationship with a planet that changes. And if that is true, then the most important lesson is not about the past, but about the future, about how we choose to live on a world that is still changing beneath our feet. We are not simply the product of civilizations that rose in fertile valleys. We are the descendants of people who moved when they had to, remembered when they could, and adapted when there was no alternative. That lineage does not guarantee wisdom, but it offers potential. As the ice continues to shift, as climates continue to change, the question quietly returns not as speculation, but as relevance. How do we carry memory forward without clinging to places that may not endure? How do we build continuity in a world defined by flux? Antarctica, silent and distant, does not answer these questions. It frames them, and perhaps that is its final role in this story. Not as a place to be proven or disproven, but as a reminder that human history is inseparable from Earth's history, and that both are written in movement as much as in settlement. If Antarctica was home, then we are and have always been a species in transition.